Chapter 24 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When Dr. Pendergrast Potter arrived, he proved to be a short, square-built man with a red spade beard and soft but shifty brown eyes, like an Airedale's. He had, he told me almost at once, studied with Jung in Vienna, and I thought of that mischievous parody, "Bliss was in it that Freud to be alive, but to be young was very heaven." "Dr. Folsom tells me, Mr. Tompkins," Potter continued in a sort of heel-clicking, stiff bow from the waist manner, which was meant, I suppose, to reveal his Viennese training, "that you have reason to believe that your business partners are plotting against you, conspiring to throw you in the asylum. This sense of special persecution, sir, have you had it long? Perhaps when you were a child you hated your father? It began then, not so? And later at school, perhaps?" I got out of bed and advanced on the psychiatrist. "Dr. Potter," I informed him, "you are here for only one reason, to certify that I am sane in the legal sense. For this service I am paying the sanctuary a fee of $5,000, to which, of course, I will add a personal fee of $1,000 to you, Dr. Potter, assuming that you can sign a certificate of sanity with a clear scientific conscience." Potter subsided in the armchair and cackled gleefully. "Boy, oh boy," he exclaimed. "For 1,000 smackers, I'd certify that Hitler is the Messiah. Damn Folsom for sending me in blind. He didn't tell me it was one of those." "Besides," I added, "I have a really serious loss of memory which is worth your attention, though I haven't time to go into it now. So get ahead with your tests, please, and let's clean up this one." "Cross your knees, either leg," he ordered, and gave me a few brisk taps just below the kneecap with the edge of his flattened palm. My knee jerks were all that could be desired. "Good," remarked Potter. "That's still the only physical test for sanity that's worth a damn. Hell, they have all sorts of gadgets, but they all amount to the same thing. Is your nervous system functioning normally, or is it not? What seems to be the trouble, Mr. Tompkins? Partners closing in on your assets, or has your wife made book with your lawyer?" "My only trouble," I informed him, "is that I'm damned if I can remember anything that happened before April 2nd of this year. That's been getting me close to trouble, and I'd like to clear it up. I remember all sorts of things before then, but it's about another man." Potter suddenly looked formidably medical. "That's what I call schizophrenia with a pretzel twist. We could keep you here and give you sedatives and baths and exercises and analysis, but it would be just the same if we left you alone. You've had some kind of shock causing a temporary occlusion of personality, and the best thing you can do is wait. Sooner or later there will be another shock and everything will come straight again. What do you think you remember from the blank period?" "Damned if I know," I replied. "I think I sank a battleship or killed a president or something." Potter laughed. "That's just a variation of the good old Napoleon complex, which is an inferiority complex gone wild. You ought to take up a hobby like expert bookbinding or watch repairing. That would give you a sense of power and you wouldn't feel the need for sinking ships. 10 to 1 you can't even shoot a decent game of golf." "I'm pretty good at poker," I defended myself. "That's not power, Mr. Tompkins. That's just shrewdness. You have a profound sense of physical inadequacy. The record says you're married. Any children?" I shook my head. "That's it," Potter declared. "We had a case like that in Jung's clinic. A baker named Hermann Schultz who insisted that he was the Emperor Friedrich Barbarossa. We were baffled for a while, since Schultz was married and had 3 children. Then we learned that his wife was the girlfriend of one of the Habsburg archdukes, and that poor Schultz was not the father of little Franz, Irma, and Ernst. We solved it for him with his wife's help. She agreed to have another child. Of course, it was the Archduke's, but Schultz never guessed. He ceased to believe that he was the Barbarossa and became a highly successful banker. What you ought to do, Mr. Tompkins, is to father a child, and then you will forget all this nonsense about battleships and presidents. Not so?" I grinned at him knowingly. "There's much in what you say, Dr. Potter. I complimented him. "But what the hell can I do about it bottled up here in the sanctuary? Just give me a clean mental bill of health in case any of my partners try to pull the fast one, and I'll go home to my wife and give earnest consideration to your suggestion. After all, if that fails, I can always take up wood carving or try another girl." "There are one or two around here," he began, then checked himself. "Well," he continued, "I can't say that I see anything really abnormal about you. Sitting here talking with you, I wouldn't have noticed any psychopathic tendencies. We psychiatrists develop a sort of sixth sense for the abnormal. I couldn't prove it scientifically, but I am as sure as Adam ate little green apples that there's nothing wrong with you that can't be cured by a drink, a kiss, and a baby." There was a brisk knock on the door and the nurse appeared. "Sorry to disturb you, doctor," she said, "but there's a man named Vail downstairs with a writ of habeas corpus for Mr. Tompkins." Potter looked at me accusingly, as though Young had never foreseen this kind of complication. "Merry Vail," I agreed. "Yes, he's my lawyer. I told him to come here, but never dreamed. Just send him up, nurse. In the meanwhile, doctor, if you could get that certificate ready." Potter again gave the effect of heel clicking and withdrew. 3 minutes later, Meriwether Vail and Arthurjean Briggs came bursting into my room. "Glory be, you're still safe, old man," my lawyer announced. "When Miss Briggs phoned me your curious message, we put 2 and 2 together." "And made it 22? I suggested. "No, we made it 4. We weren't going to stand for any nonsense from the FBI, and I owe them something for pulling me in for questioning. And when you spoke of $15,000 and a doctor, I had a brainstorm. So I flew up here and swore out a writ from the federal court. I got a deputy to help me serve it. Cost me all of $20. And here we are." I turned to Arthurjean. "Honey child," I asked, "did you by any chance think to bring me some of the office brandy? I've been moving so fast for the last 3 days that I'm out of training." My secretary turned her back, gave a sort of dip, dive and wiggle, and produced from God knows where a half-pint bottle of what proved to be excellent brandy, well warmed above room temperature. I heartlessly refused to notice Vail's pathetic signs of desperate thirst and passed the flask back to Arthurjean. "Thanks," I told her. "That just about saved my life." "Mr. Vail was all set the doctors had hijacked you and were holding you for ransom," she remarked, taking a short but deep drink herself. "Seems like there's been a mistake." "Uh-uh." I indicated strong disagreement. "I came here under my own power, and am about to leave under the same, and in my right mind." "Whoever said you weren't?" Vail demanded. "God, we'll sue them for libel." I shook my head. "It was the Secret Service, and only God can sue them," I said. "They took a notion to have me thrown in the Washington Asylum because they were sore at me on general principles. So I decided to beat them to the draw and produce a certificate of sanity." Vail looked at me with amusement. "Worst thing you could possibly do, old man," he informed me. "If you start going around showing people proof that you're not crazy, first thing you know you'll be in Mattawan. Now, if you want to prove to anybody that you're really in your right mind, you'll try to do the right thing by this little girl here." In some bewilderment, I looked at Arthurjean, whom nobody could accurately accuse of being little. "What are you driving at, Mary?" I asked. "I refer to my client, Miss Briggs," he replied with dignity. "We have strong written evidence of breach of promise." "Sugar puss?" I turned to my secretary. "Don't tell me that you've shown my letters to this legal lout." She nodded. "Sorry, Angel, but a girl's got to take care of herself in this world. You remember where you wrote me, 'Be but mine and I shall buy you a porterhouse steak with mushrooms'?" "It was onions, darling," I insisted. "Onions aren't breach of promise. Damn it, they're cause for divorce." "It was mushrooms," she repeated. "That was the same letter in which you promised me hearts of lettuce and ice cream and—" She broke down, sobbing with laughter. I pulled her face down to me and gave her a kiss. "You big slob," I told her. All you think about with democracy at the crossroads is food? Take that shyster downstairs and wait for me. I'll be down as soon as I collect my certificate. Even if I can't wear it on my coat like a campaign ribbon, it will be nice to hang in my den alongside my Harvard BA diploma and the moose I didn't kill. It was the Indian guide, but they don't count. In New Brunswick. Arthur Jean laughed. You sure do make your help sing for their supper, Angel, she told me. And just because I call you Angel, don't you start worrying about that nice wife of yours. From now on, I'll make like a sister. So I smacked her on the porte cochere and ordered her out of the room until I got dressed. As the door closed behind her and Vale, I rang for the nurse and asked to have my bags packed. Goodness, Mr. Tompkins, she exclaimed. Don't you like it here? We understood that you wanted a rest cure. She stood just a fraction of an inch too close to me, and I was aware of pretty brown hair under her starched nurse's cap, a whiff of something that smelled far more expensive than antiseptic, and a pleasantly rounded effect underneath the prim blouse of her uniform. So I put my arm around her, gave her a friendly kiss, and said, Name, please, and when do you get off duty? Emily Post, she answered. So help me, but don't let that stop you. And 9 o'clock tonight. Good, I told her. Will you join us for dinner and a drink at... What's the best hotel here, now we've a war on? The Governor Baldwin, she replied. Meet us at the Baldwin, then, as soon as you can get away. I'd like you to meet my friends socially, and... She nodded brightly and hurried from the room with a distinctly unmedical motion of her hips. A moment later, Dr. Folsom came in, his strangler's hands dangling at his side. Sorry you feel you must leave, Mr. Tompkins, he told me. Here's that certificate. It will stand up in any court east of the Mississippi if you have to use it. That will be $5,000, as agreed. I sat down at the little writing desk and laboriously made out 3 checks. One for $5,000 to the Order of the Sanctuary, one for $1,000 to the Order of Pendergrast Potter, and another for $1,000 to the Order of... Any initials, Dr. Folsom? I asked. A.J., he replied. But just make it to the Sanctuary. A.J. Folsom, I wrote on the final check and endorsed it with W.S. Tompkins, as well as I could with my still bandaged fingers. What? Folsom was startled. Gosh, you're a nice man, Mr. Tompkins, and Potter will be glad to have this, too. He is... Think nothing of it, I announced grandly. The market's been working for me all week, and this won't even cost you income tax. I'll put it down as a gift. Folsom's face was positively transfigured with gratitude, and a devotion that would not have been out of place in a stained glass window. By George, he insisted, you are a nice man. I'll be proud to go before the Supreme Court of the United States and testify... He stopped abruptly. Are these checks good? He inquired. Oh, come, doctor, who's loony now? I demanded. Why would I expose myself to a bad check charge just to get out of a private asylum with my lawyer fully equipped with a writ? That's so, that's so. He beamed, reassured. Well, sir, it's been fine having you here, and any time, day or night, if you want refuge from this stormy blast, just come out to the Sanctuary. We'll always be honored to put you up and give you the best we have for as long as you care to stay. Believe me, Mr. Tompkins, it may seem odd, but you'll never find warmer hospitality or a more sincere welcome than right here in this little old asylum. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The grill in the Governor Baldwin was not crowded, and we had no trouble getting a pleasant table in the corner, while 4 colored men blew into metal objects, hit things, and delivered themselves with various rhythmic noises. From time to time they paused in order to allow the perspiring couples who jiggled and writhed on the dance floor time to cool off.
While waiting for Emily Post to appear, Arthurjean was very subordinate, calling me Mr. Tompkins, and acting quite as the boss's secretary should act when out for dinner with the boss. Mary Vale was in high spirits and insisted on having the deputy who had helped serve the writ join us for a drink. But the deputy was a pallid young man with, he told us, a heart murmur that kept him out of the armed forces, and he never touched anything strong. So we shed him ahead of the time when the nurse from the sanctuary showed up in a slick dancing dress that seemed painted on her torso, and a makeup that was a tribute to the skill of the advertisers of cosmetics. Vale took one look at her and his face lit up like Broadway. "Spring is in the air," he remarked to the world at large. "Will you dance, Miss Post?" She flashed a smile that promised some and hinted at more, and said, "You bet." I watched them as they took the dance floor, and the music took them. I turned back to my secretary. "What gives, Angel?" I asked. She beamed at me. "Winnie," she observed, "you're it. Perhaps the most famous man in Wall Street, in a quiet way. You caught the market just right. Mr. Wasson and Mr. Cohn pulled out just right before the big operators decided they must be patriotic and support quotations before you made too much money. We've cleaned up nearly $3 million. And Mr. Cohn's so happy about it, he's got him a brand new girlfriend." "How about Wasson?" I asked. "Has success gone to his head?" "Oh, he's just the same as ever. He didn't bat an eyelash except to say that you were one wise so-and-so to figure the break." "And how about yourself, Arthurjean?" She grinned at me. "I guess a girl can tell when she's washed up with a swell guy." "But you're not Winnie." "Not the Winnie I knew. And there aren't going to be any fun and games from now on, I guess." She took a hearty pull at her highball. "So we're friends," she announced. "You've got a swell wife waiting for you. If you ever need me, I'll be around. If you don't, that's okay too. But God, honey child, we did have us some fun, Winnie and I. He had a theory that monogamy was a kind of hardwood that grows in the tropics, and that made him kind of nice to play with. What gives with you?" I gave her a fill-in on the Washington trip and the events that had brought me to the sanctuary, and she listened with a growing smile. "Why," she began, but the music stopped and Vale and Miss Post returned to the table. "Winnie," Vale announced, "spring hath come to Hartford, Connecticut, and I've decided to take a room at this hotel. This is a mighty fine little city, isn't it? Clean, vital, New England honesty and all that, not to mention insurance. And," his eyes strayed fondly in the direction of the nurse, who sat with eyes demurely downcast. "Okay," I told him. "This is the official opening of spring. Just give me those papers I wanted to sign. The money for Dr. Rutherford, I mean." He stared at me. "You don't mean to say you were serious about that?" he exclaimed. "I thought it was a gag to tip me off that you were being railroaded to the asylum. Hell, I'll have the stuff drawn up and you can sign it on Monday. There's nothing doing in town over the weekend, and Rutherford can wait. If you like, I'll try to beat him down. For my money, he'll settle for $5,000, and to hell with his family honor." I shook my head. "No dice, Mary. It's 15,000, a gentleman's agreement." "Hell, no gentleman has any business making agreements. That's what lawyers are for." The music started up with a rather miscegenated attempt to marry Mendelssohn's Spring Song to Pistol Packing Mama. He grabbed Emily Post by the arm. "Come on," he urged. "Gotta dance. I'll show you some steps that aren't in the book of etiquette." "Why, Mr. Vale," she agreed, and they were off again. I resumed my talk with Arthurjean. "You'd better stay here too," I told her. "It's getting late and they lock up the trains on the New Haven Road along with the cows." She looked the question at me. "Nope," I stuttered sturdily. "I'm going to drive back and see whether spring has come to Bedford Hills. Even commuters have children now and then, I added. They used to blame it on sunspots or Roosevelt, but now I guess they'll have nobody to blame but themselves. In return for a 5-spot, the hotel doorman told me how to find the nearest black market gas station, so I tanked up the Packard and worked myself across country till I hit the Parkway. The night was clear and cool, but there was a hint of blossoms in the air. Vail was right. Spring had come to the commuters, and I thought sardonically of what could be expected at every country club the next night, Saturday. I missed the turnoff for Bedford Hills and wasted a couple of hours wandering amiss through the maze of Westchester roads, but finally I found myself on a familiar road and soon eased the Packard to a slow stop on the crackling gravel of the entrance of Pook's Hill. I left my bags in the car and walked quietly along the grass until I let myself in at the front door. A muffled woof from the kitchen showed that Ponto had drowsily recognized my tread as I tiptoed up the stairs and into my bedroom. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and the frogs were still jingling in the marshy meadows as I stood by the window and tasted the night air. Then I undressed rapidly and put on a dressing gown and slippers. I turned off the lights and tiptoed across the hall to my wife's bedroom. Her door was closed, but when I turned the handle, it proved not to be locked or bolted. I closed it softly behind me and approached the edge of the bed. Germaine was sleeping quietly, the faint glow of the starlight outlining her dark hair against the white pillow. Suddenly she started. "What? Who's that?" she cried. I leaned over and brushed her hair with my lips. "It's me," I told her truthfully. "Everything's all right." "Hurry," she murmured. "You'll catch cold." A moment later, she remarked conversationally, "Heavens, you are cold." Then she burrowed herself against me and wordlessly raised her lips to mine. When I opened my eyes in the morning, the bed felt strangely deserted. I reached over and found that I was alone. "Jimmy!" I called. "Jimmy!" She appeared at the bathroom door. "Hello," she remarked. "Where did you come from? And what are you doing here? Don't you know that all respectable married couples sleep in separate rooms, according to House and Garden?" "I'm not respectable," I told her. "Please notify the editor." "You certainly are not," she observed. "You nearly gave me heart failure sneaking into my room like that, when you were supposed to be in Hartford. It would have served you right if I'd called for the police." "I'm just as good as the average policeman," I suggested. "Come over here and I'll show you how we Tompkinses—" But she evaded me. "No, sir. We must set a good example to the servants. It's way past breakfast time, and I don't want Myrtle to guess that we're absolutely shameless." Breakfast was waiting for us when we came downstairs, and we gave a reasonably good impersonation of an elderly married couple at the breakfast table. I read the financial section of the Times, and Germaine again busied herself with the social page of the Herald Tribune, now and then reading brief items about marriages and divorces, while I grunted noncommittally about the state of the market. As a matter of fact, we both believed we had succeeded admirably, when our attention was attracted by a meaning kind of cough. It was Mary Myrtle. "What is it, Myrtle?" Germaine asked with a radiant smile. "It's not my business to say so," the maid stammered, "but I wanted to know whether you would really keep me on. I like it here, and I'm so happy you're happy, Mrs. Tompkins." "Of course you're going to stay with us, Myrtle, but however did you guess?" "You can see it in your face, Mrs. Tompkins," she said. "And Mr. Tompkins, he was looking at the sporting page and talking about U.S. Steel and AT&T, and, oh, it's nice." And she fled from the room. Germaine looked at me like the angel at the gates of Eden. "There," she exclaimed. "That's what happens when I trust you. You can't even find the right page in the paper to fake from. Next time, I'm going to marry a man who doesn't look so damned happy it's a giveaway." "It's spring," I explained stupidly. You know, Winnie, my wife said suddenly, speaking of spring, I've been thinking about Ponto. You've had him for 5 years now, and I think he's getting a little queer. Don't you think it would be a good idea to send him to the kennels and have him bred? Perhaps that's all that's been wrong with him. Spoken like a woman, Jimmy, I said, but I agree that it wouldn't do any harm. I'll phone Dalrymple after breakfast and have him send over for Ponto's Sacre du Printemps. He's got championship blood, and unlike holy matrimony, there's money in it. She shrugged her shoulders unspeakably. Poor Winnie, she mocked. You'd be worth millions if you'd been paid like Ponto. It mightn't be a bad idea at that, I remarked. If you realize the years of apprenticeship and training, the high degree of professional skill required. Come here then, she ordered. I'll pay you. She did. You won't forget about Ponto, she added, breathless after her kiss. The poor darling oughtn't to be celibate in this household. I wouldn't want it to happen to a dog. End of chapter 25.
Chapter 26 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. On the morning of Monday, April 23rd, the date seemed unimportant at the time. I took the early morning train into New York. Spring had done its fell work, and the club car was full of middle-aged businessmen with dark circles under their eyes, prepared to fight at the drop of a hat anyone who said they weren't as young as they felt. With Jimmy's perfume still in my nostrils, I hadn't the heart to deride them, so I did the next best thing and talked them into a poker game. By the time we pulled into Grand Central, I was $18.70 ahead, thanks to a full house just before we reached 125th Street. Instead of joining my fellow brokers in their Gadarene rush for the downtown subway express, I strolled north along Park Avenue to the Pond Club. At the Pond Club, I found Tammy engaged, as ever, in polishing the glasses behind his gleaming little bar. "My, Mr. Tompkins," he exclaimed. "You look as though you just made $1 million, he told me. The usual, sir?" "It was nearly 3 millions, Tammy, and accept no substitutes. What I need is concentrated protein. How about a couple of dozen Kodowitz and some black coffee?" The steward raised his eyebrows knowingly. "I'll mix you one of my second-day specials, sir," he said. "Funny thing about that drink. One night, young Mr. Ferguson, he's a new member, sir, was feeling merry and felt a sudden sense of compassion for the statue of civic virtue in front of City Hall. Of course, I've never seen it, but they tell me that it's a very fine work of art by a person named Mac Monnies, I believe. He wasn't a member of the club, of course, but that's what I understand the name to be. So Mr. Ferguson would have nothing for it but to take one of my second-day specials down to the Civic Virtue and give him a drink. It seemed that Mr. Ferguson felt quite sorry for the statue down there in front of LaGuardia without any company. So he took a cab downtown and poured the drink down the mouth of the statue, for a joke, like. But here's the odd thing, sir. They had to throw a canvas over the statue and send for a man with a hacksaw before the mayor decided it was proper to expose it to the citizens again. Then bring me a double second-day special, without cold chisels or hacksaws, if you please, I ordered. He smirked knowingly, but had the tact of good club servants to say nothing. I sipped his concoction, which tasted entirely unlike the eggnog it outwardly resembled. A moment later, I tried another sip. It was not at all unpleasant, so I drained the glass. This, I decided, was exactly what I needed, so I drank the second one without drawing a breath. Ah! I beamed. That is much better. Now, if anybody phones me, say I'm not here, unless it's one of my friends. Would that be true of that Mrs. R., sir? He inquired. That lady with the red hair you told me about, Mr. Tompkins? If Mrs. Rutherford calls, I said, let me know. He smiled slyly. Then I was to deliver a message to you from her, sir. She wants you to call her at the apartment, she said. Circle 87326, the number is. She said it was important. I dialed the number. Virginia answered. Winnie? Her voice was cool and amused.
You'd better come up here in a hurry. It's urgent.
Where is here? I asked.
At our place. The apartment, she said.
Better give me the address, I suggested. I can't seem to remember.
Winnie, that particular joke is getting tiresome. You know perfectly well it's 172 East 72nd Street and the third floor front. The name, naturally, is Smith.
John Smith? I inquired.
Natch. And hurry, unless you want to be in worse trouble than you can imagine.
I signaled to Tammy. One more second day special, please. He looked worried. Are you quite sure, sir? He demurred. 2 is as much as I've ever seen a man take. He returned to his mystery and produced the fatal brew. I drank it slowly. By Godfrey, this was more like it. I tossed him a $5 bill. Just remember that you haven't seen me, I told him. Quite, Mr. Tompkins. I managed to snag an uptown taxi and rolled in comfort to 172 East 72nd Street. I pressed the button marked Smith and was rewarded by a clicking of the latch. I climbed the stairs and on the 3rd story tapped the little brass knocker. The door opened and Virginia appeared clad somewhat in a white silk dressing gown and with her red hair sizzling out at me. Come in, stranger, she said. She closed the door and settled herself comfortably with a cigarette on the suspiciously broad daybed. I sat down in a very deep easy chair facing her and lighted a cigarette too. Well, I inquired. Winnie, she began, you know I never try to interfere with your private life or try to ask questions, but don't you think this farce has gone on long enough? I flicked some ash on the carpet and tried to look inscrutable. You know what you were doing, of course, she continued, and your performance in Washington was magnificent, but just between ourselves, can't you relax? Although the windows were open, the room seemed oppressively warm. I threw back my coat and confronted her without speaking.
Of course, Virginia continued, I know we've got to be discreet. There can always be dictaphones and detectives, and it seems that the FBI knows all about this place, but can't you just... She jumped up and faced me. With an angry movement, she snatched off her dressing gown and flung it on the floor. There, she said. Is there anything wrong with me? Am I repulsive, or don't you care?
It must have been the 3 specials that lifted me from the easy chair and whisked me across the room to the embattled redhead. But it must have been my guardian angel that prompted my next move. I pulled out my fountain pen and wrote rapidly on the back of an envelope, I suspect that we are watched. Her eyes widened, and she quickly grabbed her gown and draped it around her. I laid my finger to my lips. What I came to see you about, Virginia, I said, is to tell you once and for all that all is over between us. That was a mistake. She gave me a wink, dropped the gown, and came and sat beside me on the arm of the chair. I too, Winfred, she said dramatically, have become increasingly distressed by your apparent coldness. She cuddled down and planted her lips on my ear while her tongue flicked like a little snake's. No, she continued, the time has come, Winfred, when we must face the facts, unpleasant though they may be. I was never meant to be a part-time girl for any man. Her sharp little teeth nipped my neck savagely. Virginia, I said, what I had to say, what I mean is... I never said it. Her mouth was suddenly glued to mine, and she melted into my arms. Damn you, I told her. There. The apartment doorbell was buzzing like an accusation. Tell them to go away, she murmured. Say we're not at home. I disentangled myself, ran to the door, and jiggled the button that released the downstairs catch. Go and make yourself decent, I told her. I'll stall them, if you aren't too long. I listened as the footsteps slowly mounted the stairs. It was a man's step. Then came a brisk tap on the brass knocker. I opened up. It was A.J. Harcourt of the FBI. He seemed rather surprised to see me. "Good morning, Mr. Tompkins," he began. "I thought that—" "Oh, come on in," I urged him. "Mrs. Rutherford will be out in a moment. He nodded. "You certainly do get around," he admitted. "Last the Bureau heard, you were a patient up in Hartford, and here I find you in a love nest," I suggested. "A den of perfumed sin, a high-priced hellhole. I got here about 10 minutes ago. Mrs. Rutherford said that I might be in trouble, but she didn't get around to explaining what trouble." He grinned. "When a girl speaks of trouble, she means herself," he orated. "Oh, is that so?" Virginia appeared at the entrance to the bathroom, completely, though revealingly clad, and advanced into the room brandishing her sex like an invisible shillelagh. "And what has the FBI to do with me, Mr. Harcourt?" she demanded. Poor Harcourt looked abashed, but made a speedy recovery, getting out of the rough in one stroke. "Now that Mr. Tompkins is here, Mrs. Rutherford, ma'am," he said, "I have nothing to see you about. We heard he had gone to a private asylum in New England, and I was told to see you and ask if you knew any of the circumstances." "Oh." Virginia sat down on the rumpled daybed. "That sounds rather like a lie, you know." "That's not my fault, ma'am," Harcourt replied. "My chief gives me my orders and I follow them without being asked for my opinion. If the Bureau wants to check on Mr. Tompkins through his friends—" Virginia beamed and dimpled. "You couldn't do better than come to me," she admitted. "Well, here I am," I told him, "and Mrs. Rutherford needn't feel bothered. What is it now?" "We just wanted to get the rights of your run-in with the Secret Service," he told me. "Our liaison there told the director that you stood Chief Flynn on his ear and that Flynn threatened to swear out a lunacy warrant against you. How come?" I gave him a full account of my encounter with the Secret Service, and ended by producing the certificate of sanity signed by Dr. Folsom. "There it is," I declaimed. The special agent smiled. "You're nothing if not thorough, Mr. Tompkins. Have you had any luck filling in the blank period before Easter? The Bureau would feel much happier if you could remember. Now, don't get me wrong, the case against you is closed. You're off our books. We believe that you're telling the truth, but just the same, it seems funny you can't remember." Virginia Rutherford turned on him like a battleship bringing a battery of 16-inch guns to bear on a freighter. "Perhaps he has a good reason for not remembering," she remarked. "Perhaps he went somewhere with someone in skirts." "That's just what puzzles us," Harcourt admitted. "We've had 50 agents from New York office alone making checks as far north as Montreal, in Portland, Boston, Providence, and even Cincinnati and Richmond. We've checked trains, buses, airlines, and the garages, as well as the hotels, boarding houses, and overnight cabins. There isn't anybody that can remember seeing Mr. Tompkins, with or without a woman, during that week." "Then you're still investigating me?" I asked, while a chill went down my spine. The special agent shook his head. "Not at all, Mr. Tompkins. Like I told you, the investigation was called off last week when we established your Z2 identity. This is just the result of the inquiries we started the week before last." "And you can't find a trace?" I asked. "Not a thing," he said. Mrs. Rutherford turned to me, flung her arms around me, and planted a far from sisterly kiss on my lips. "Winnie, old dear," she observed, "you are simply incredible." And she left the apartment. "Wonder what she meant by that?" Harcourt mused. "We're probably happier in ignorance," I told him. "Come on, AJ, I'll buy a taxi downtown. I've got to stop in at my office and gather some of my unearned income. They tell me we've made nearly $3 million in the last 10 days. Harcourt consulted his notebook. "The Bureau's figures put it at $2,870,246.71, if you want to know," he said. "So you are keeping me watched," I remarked. "What do you think?" asked Special Agent Harcourt of the FBI. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. What's the big idea? I demanded. I thought I was in the clear. Harcourt looked somewhat embarrassed. Perhaps I oughtn't to tell you this, Mr. Tompkins, he explained. But like you said, you're in the clear with the Bureau. We've checked and double-checked, and any way we slice it, you're still okay. Maybe you're Tompkins with a lapse of memory. Maybe this yarn of yours about Jacqueline is on the level. But we're sure of you. Then why all this interest in me? I asked. You've been swell with me personally, but it's getting on my nerves having you pop up all the time. Though, I must say, I was relieved when you showed up today. Mrs. Rutherford, he grinned. Redhead spell trouble anywhere, anytime, he observed. No, it's this von Bieberstein we're gunning for. Mr. Lamb at the Bureau has a notion that von Bieberstein may have some connection with you that you don't know about. He might be using your office as a post box, or be somebody that you know as someone else. It sounds screwy, I know, but this von Bieberstein is a slick baby. For all I know, he might even be a woman. I glanced inquiringly in the direction of Virginia's apartment. Not for my money, he said. We've checked her too. And it isn't that Tennessee secretary of yours either. There's a girl for you. We've got her biog right back to the Knoxville dock that delivered her. But the Bureau doesn't think it's an accident that you turned up in the middle of this case. So I've been told off to check on all your contacts. Seems mighty funny, you a millionaire and me an average guy, even if Arthurjean still thinks I got a wife in Brooklyn. But it's the war, I guess. Says every moron, there's a war on, I quoted. I scratched my head. If only I could remember that blank spot, I might be able to help you. Harcourt studied his fingernails attentively. We're taking care of your office contacts, of course, and we have a couple of men working up in Bedford Hills. But New York's a hell of a big town, and almost anything could happen to you outside of your office and your clubs. Got any ideas? What sort? Well, there's always women, but I guess we've carried that line as far as it will take us. We've checked the doctors and the dentists and the bars and the nightclubs. How about astrologers, say? Hitler made use of them in Germany. He might use them over here, though we've screened them all since before Pearl Harbor. I laughed. I doubt that a man like Tompkins would use astrology, I told him. Harcourt shook his head. That's where you'd be wrong. You'd be surprised how many big Wall Street operators go for that guff. It doesn't register, I replied. But I'll phone the office and see if Miss Briggs knows. When I made the connection, Arthurjean informed me that the phone had been ringing all morning. And when would I be in? Vale, she reported, was still in Hartford with a bad case of Emily Post. I asked her about astrologers, and she said she didn't know, but would find out. In a little while, she reported that Phil Cohn thought I'd once gone to see that Ernestina Klump that used to advise the Morgan partners. Okay, I told her. I'll be in about 4 this afternoon, and we'll handle any calls or visitors then. I turned to Harcourt. It doesn't sound like much, but Phil Cohn thinks I once consulted Ernestina Klump. Want me to make an appointment? He nodded, so I looked up her number and dialed the office in the Chrysler Building where Miss Klump kept track of the stars in their courses and the millionaires in their jitters. Arranging for an immediate appointment through the very, very well-bred secretarial voice that stiff-armed me was not easy until I said that I would pay double fees. Then she believed it might be arranged. That will be $2,000, she imparted, and you must be here at 1 o'clock precisely. As we taxied downtown together, Harcourt was uncommunicative, except for the remark that it was right handy to Grand Central and would be no trick to stop off before catching trains. Miss Klump, as it turned out, was a motherly woman whose wrinkled cheeks and plump hands suggested greater familiarity with the cook stove than with the planets. Her office showed the most refined kind of charlatanry. Everything quite solid and in good taste, with no taint of the zodiac. At a guess, about $10,000 worth of furnishings was involved, and I imagined that the annual rental might run as high as $6,000.
"Well, Mr. Tompkins," Miss Clump remarked in a pleasant, homey voice with a trace of Midwestern flatness, "I wondered when you would be in to see me again. The stars being mean to you, or is it another woman?"
"Let's see," I stalled. "When was the last time I consulted you?" She cackled.
"Young man, you've been coming to see me, off and on, the last 10 years. Last time was in March. That was about the redhead. Virgo in the house of Scorpio, you called it."
I nodded. That would be it, I guess. She's more Scorpion than Virgin. She patted my hand comfortingly across the table.
"They all are," she said, "unless they're really in love. Then even the stars can't stop 'em. What's the matter now?"
"Police," I said. "Loss of memory. Women and money are all right, but I'm being followed and I've drawn sort of blank for the whole month of March. Can you take a look at my horoscope and tell me what the stars were doing to me then?" She stared at me shrewdly.
"Police," she remarked. "Land's sakes, I don't want trouble with the police, young man. You—"
I hastened to interrupt her. "That's only a figure of speech. I'm in trouble with the government. Just tell me what I was doing in March and give me a hint of what lies ahead next month." She examined the chart carefully and made a few penciled notes on a scratch pad. Then she looked up at me in bewilderment.
"This doesn't make much sense, Mr. Tompkins," she told me, "but here it is. So far as I can make out, in March you went on a long trip and had some kind of bad accident. There's Neptune and Saturn in conjunction under Aries and Venus in opposition. That could mean more trouble with that girl, I suppose. Then, early in April, you came under a new sign. Money, it looks like. Lots of it. And Venus is right for you. It looks like happiness. Now for the future. There's something I don't understand. There's a sort of jumble. An accident, maybe? Right ahead of you, and then some kind of crisis. You're going to live quite happy with a woman for a while, and, well, that's all I can see, except—" She paused. I raised my eyebrows. "Except what?" I asked. "I want the truth." She lowered her head. "It might be a bad illness," she said, "but it's the combination I generally call a death. Somebody else's death, that is. You aren't planning to murder anybody, are you?" I leaned back in my chair and laughed heartily. "Good God, no, Miss Clump. And even if I did, I have money enough to hire somebody to do it for me, like the government. Here's a check for you," I added. $2,000, I think you said?" "Be careful," she told me in a low voice, almost in a whisper. "Be very, very careful. I don't like to see that combination in the stars. It might mean bad trouble." I rejoined Harcourt in the downstairs bar of the Vanderbilt Hotel and gave him a quick account of Miss Clump's forecast. "That looks pretty hot," he allowed, "except that it sounds like anybody. The usual line is money coming in, successful trouble, and just call again sometime. Anyhow, the Bureau doesn't handle murder, and you don't look like a killer to me, even though you've got yourself back in good shape. Physically, I mean." She sounded pretty much in earnest, I told him, but I'm damned if I know where I'd begin if I went in for a career of killing. "So you think she's on the level?" he asked. "It's all hooey to me." I considered carefully before I answered him. "The astrologers claim," I told him, "that they practice an exact science. They have won lawsuits based on that claim, and have won exemption from the old statutes against gypsies and fortune tellers. Miss Clump is a good showwoman. Her fees are high as the Chrysler Building, and her office costs plenty. No stuffed owls or dried bats or any junk that would make a businessman think he was going slumming. When she talked to me, she seemed honestly surprised at what she claimed she saw in the stars, and she certainly sounded entirely in earnest when she warned me.
My guess is that she's on the level and has nothing to do with von Bieberstein, if there is such a person. Harcourt sipped his Coca-Cola, being on duty and hence not drinking, in official silence. Yeah, he agreed at last. Could be, though we'll have to check her and her secretary and her clients. Right up to, but not including Democratic senators and cabinet officers. How about barbershops, I asked him, or drugstores? I've always thought they'd make the best intelligence centers in America. You can't keep track of everybody who buys a dime's worth of aspirin or a package of Kleenex. What's to prevent the cigar counter at any hotel or drugstore being the place where two Nazi agents meet? The clerks wouldn't know them, and in a town like this, nobody would even notice them. The special agent finished his drink and banged the glass down on the table. That's just the trouble with this town, he announced. There's so many services here that everybody uses that you can't possibly check them. Well, you run on down to your office and see if you can't find out something else. Thanks for the lift on Miss Clump. Now I've got to call headquarters and get a special detail to go to work on her. You don't seriously think that she knows anything about von Bieberstein, do you? I asked. He smiled ruefully. No, I don't. But the way you describe her, she's a sort of nice, old-fashioned woman, and yet she drags down $1,000 for 15 minutes of astral horse feathers in this tough burg. There's something screwy about a setup like that. Now, I've seen the files on most of the big-time astrologers that operated here. Evangeline Adams and Myra Kingsley were tops in their time, and there's not one of them can touch this Clump woman for money. I don't forget that the first woman I ever arrested, it was before I joined the Bureau and I was on the homicide detail in Raleigh, was just as sweet and gentle as your Aunt Minnie. All she'd done was poison her husband and her 2 children so's to be free to sleep with her brother-in-law. So it's going to be plenty work for the Bureau to check this one before we're sure she's okay. I told him that I didn't enjoy being put in the position of an FBI Typhoid Mary, who automatically exposed his acquaintances to immediate visitations of G-men. Shucks, Mr. Tompkins, he assured me. They'll never know we're around. We've got a pretty smooth outfit now, and we have ways of checking you've never dreamed of. When we go to work, we do a neat job, and if we don't learn anything, well, that's that. But we don't bother folks while we're doing it. All right, I agreed. I'll be down at the office until the morning. End of chapter 27.
Chapter 28 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The highly respectable receptionist at the office of Tompkins, Wasson & Cohn almost smiled at me. "There are several gentlemen waiting for you, Mr. Tompkins," she announced. "Some of them have been waiting since before lunch. Do you plan to receive them, or shall I ask them to return tomorrow?" "No, I'll see them in a few minutes," I replied. "Miss Briggs will let you know." No sooner had I settled down at my desk, however, than Graham Wasson and Phil Cohn came dancing in, wreathed in ticker tape. "We're rich! We're rich!" they chanted. "Where's the Marine Band, and hail to the Chief?" I asked. "How rich are we, anyway?" "We cleaned up," Wasson said. "Just a bit under $3 million in 1 week. It was as you said. We went short of the market, and after Roosevelt's death, boy did they liquidate. And thanks to Phil here, we got out before the big boys put the squeeze on the shorts." "That reminds me, Winnie," Cohn interrupted. "One of the mourners in the customer's room who's waiting to see you is Jim DeForest from Morgan's. He's been waiting here since 2 o'clock. You'd better see him quick, huh? We don't want to keep 23 Wall waiting, do we?" "Nuts, Phil," I told him. "I'll see them in the order of their arrival. That's what they do at Morgan's when you haven't got an appointment." I pushed the button for Arthurjean. "Who's been waiting the longest, Miss Briggs?" I asked. She consulted a little pack of memo forms. "There's this Mr. Sylvester," she said. "He was here when the office opened and has been waiting here all day. He wouldn't state his business." "Okay," I replied. "Send him in or he'll faint from hunger." Mr. Sylvester was florid in a quiet Latin way and looked as though he might be anything from an operatic tenor to the proprietor of a gambling ship. He waited until my partners had withdrawn. "Mr. Tompkins," he said, speaking quietly, "I represent a syndicate that's reorganizing the free market in meat. We need a real smart guy, well connected like yourself, to head it up and keep track of the money. We'll pay $1 million a year any way you like it. Swiss banks, Havana, Buenos Aires, Mexico City, and no tax. I'm always interested in $1 million, but I never did like Atlanta," I told him. "Atlanta?" He shrugged his shoulders. "We got lawyers could talk Capone out of Alcatraz, and we got a fix on the courts too. What would you be doing in Atlanta?" "I doubt that they'd make me librarian," I said, "and I don't think I'd make the ball team. So I guess I'd have to work in the laundry. What's the trouble with the black market anyhow? Seems to me you've got OPA right in your corner." "Too many amateurs and outsiders," he told me, "just like with prohibition. Meat's bad and too many cops get a cut. We aim to do like the beer syndicates. Organize it right, keep prices reasonable, have the payoff stabilized, making it a good banking proposition. We've checked on you. You're smart. Would $1.5 million do?" I shook my head. "I've got $1.5 million, I remarked. "Okay." Mr. Sylvester straightened up, shook my hand and gave a little bow. "Think it over," he urged. "If you change your mind, put an ad in the Saturday Review personal column. Meet me anywhere, Winnie. That's cute. Meet and meet. See? Our representative will call on you." I asked Arthurjean to send in the next visitor, and to my surprise, she announced DeForest. "Hell," I told her, "there must have been others ahead of him." "There was," she said, "but they agreed to let him see you first. They said they'd be back tomorrow. They were from Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers, so they wanted to give Morgan's first crack at you, I guess." Jim DeForest proved to be one of the vaguely familiar figures I had noticed flitting around the Harvard Club. "Winnie," he said, "I just dropped in to say that we have been pretty well impressed by the way your firm handled itself in this recent market. Mr. Whitney wanted to know whether it would be convenient for you to drop in and have a talk with him soon." "Today?" I asked. DeForest glanced at his Rolex. "Today's a little late," he remarked, "but give him a ring tomorrow. No, damn it, he's leaving for a short trip to Washington. Make it next week and he'll have plenty of time for you." "What's it about, Jim?" I asked. "Don't tell me that I'm going to be offered a Morgan partnership." He looked as though I had burped in church. "I hardly think so," he replied. "If that were the case, Mr. Lamont would have seen you somewhere uptown. You know the way they gossip in the street. No, I rather fancy that Mr. Whitney wants you to be one of our brokers for floor operations. Or he might, since you specialize in estate work, want you to help with some of the new issues we are planning to underwrite." "Either way would suit me fine, Jim," I told him. "Do you know," I continued, "this is the second happiest day of my life? The first was when I got married." DeForest seemed a bit relieved and permitted himself a worldly smile. "And today," I continued, "I received the greatest honor that can come to an American in Wall Street. Believe me, Jim, this means more than having just cleaned up $3 million in straight trading. After all, what is money worth if I can't buy what isn't for sale?" This idea seemed to be taken under DeForest's advisement for future consideration, but he let it pass. After all, $1 million is dross compared to the approval of the employers of men like Jim DeForest, still limping along on $25,000 a year 20 years after graduation. "Grand to have seen you, Winnie," he said, indicating that the audience was at an end. "I'll tell Mr. Whitney that you'll see him next week. And of course, no talk about this. We don't like to encourage gossip about our operations." I promised that I would be silent as the grave, not even telling my partners or my wife. "After all," I pointed out, "it's not a good idea to arouse false hopes. Perhaps Mr. Whitney will change his mind." "I hope not," DeForest said solemnly, as though I had mentioned the possibility of the Black Death.
I most certainly hope not. We don't do business on that basis, you know. Well, Miss Briggs, who's next? I inquired, after DeForest had withdrawn, with an affable air of royalty inspecting a clean but second-rate orphan asylum.
Since those bankers left, there's only 3 waiting. One's a general, but he comes after this other man. What's his name? Patrick Michael Shaughnessy, whoever he is.
Send in the Irish, I told her.
Mr. Shaughnessy was an Irish-American counterpart of the Mr. Sylvester who wanted to reorganize the free market for meat. He was a natty dresser, and he spoke out of the corner of his mouth.
Mr. Tompkins, he told me, I'm from the Democratic National Committee. The chairman, and gee, Bob's a wonder, wanted to ask whether you'd consider a diplomatic appointment.
Of course I would, I replied, thinking of Germaine's artless desire to be an ambassadress. But that depends on where I'm sent and that kind of thing. What have you in mind?
There's only one post open right now, he remarked. That's Bologna or Peruna or hell no, it's Bolivia. That's somewhere in America, isn't it?
I agreed that Bolivia was located in the Western Hemisphere. That's where the tin and llamas come from, Mr. Shaughnessy, I educated him. The capital city of La Paz is located about 12,000 feet high in the Andes, and the inhabitants are mainly Indians. I don't think that Mrs. Tompkins would care for that. His face fell.
You'd be an ambassador, of course, he informed me, and that's always worth something. But the boss said, that's Bob, of course, we call Bob the boss, that if you wouldn't fall for Bolivia to ask you what about Ottawa. That's the capital of Canada. It's right next to Montreal and those places. And there's good train service to New York on the Central anytime you want to run down for a show or a haircut. Bob said Canada was a real buy.
Oh, a buy, I remarked. Shaughnessy looked at me shrewdly.
Uh-huh,
he remarked. How much will it cost me to be ambassador to Canada? Shaughnessy was faintly aggrieved.
The boss don't like to talk about money and jobs that way, Mr. Tompkins. He always says, think of the chance to serve the country. Say, you're a good Democrat, or if you aren't a Democrat, you're the next thing to it, a Republican, that is, and you want to make a contribution to the party. We always got a deficit, see. If there ain't one now, there's one coming right up. Say you lay $200 or $300 on the line. That goes $100 to the committee and another $100 divided among the state committees. You see, we got to take care of the Senate so they'll vote to confirm you. And there are some operators up there who won't vote for nothing except they got taken care of first. Then the rest we put into a dignified publicity campaign to build you up with the public and let the Canucks see they're getting something special when the president nominates you.
I considered this one carefully. Do you let me pick the public relations firm that handles that end of the campaign, Mr. Shaughnessy? He grinned artlessly.
I should say not, he chuckled. How do you think we boys on the committee make a living? No, we pick the firm that does the job, and that's all you need to worry about. We own them. So you see, you're protected right across the board. Anytime we sell an ambassadorship, we deliver.
Doesn't the State Department have something to say about it? Shaughnessy told me exactly what the State Department could do about it, so I told him to let me have a few days to think it over. After all, $300,000 was quite a bit of money to pay for a diplomatic post. It wasn't as though I could make it pay off in Scotch whiskey or mining shares, as in the past.
That's what you think,
the agent of the Democratic National Committee rapped out.
Listen, Mr. Tompkins, if you buy that job, take me along as your private secretary, and I'll show you how to make it pay like a bank, and no ifs. What shall I tell the gang?
Tell them I'm definitely interested, I replied truthfully, but I'd like a couple of weeks to think it over. My next visitor was General Forbes Dutton of the Army Service Forces.
Remember me, Winnie?
Why, sure, I replied with great cordiality.
If it isn't, that's right,
the General interrupted.
Well, boy, after Pearl Harbor, I was asked to go to Washington to help out. So the bank said it was my duty, that they'd hold my job for me, and I've been there ever since.
I'm on Westervelt's staff in charge of financial procurement policies. Neat, huh? So you're still working for the bank? Not for them, Winnie, with them. We're both working for the government. Financing war contracts, you know. Now, Westervelt's heard good things about you, Winnie. He was much impressed by the way you turned down that gang of chiselers who tried to horn in on the quinine deal. They're all out. He's got a big job in mind for you. How'd you like to be a brigadier general? It's a little late for that, I told him. The war's almost over. He laughed very heartily. Ha ha ha! It's a honey of a job, Winnie. Here's what gives. This war's almost over, as you say. Then the Army will have the job of selling off the stuff it doesn't need, and boy, it has everything. We've just about cornered everything there is, and the whole world's going to be crying for this stuff. We want a good trader in charge who knows how to play ball with the boys. Realistic, that is. No stargazer, huh? And that's where you come in. There's millions in it. Hell, there's billions. We gotta go slow in selling it or we'd bust the market, wreck values and stall reconversion. So we had us a brainstorm when we heard how you cleaned up in the funeral market. How about it? Want to play ball and get next to the biggest break you've ever heard of? I looked Forbes Dutton squarely in the eye. Isn't it going to be a headache? I asked. I mean, won't there be a stink in Congress about it? I'm no fall guy. The general shook his head. Congress is in on it. Every man jack of them, outside a few screwballs, he assured me. We got a deal worked out in every district, all legal and clean, of course. So there isn't a senator or congressman that can't march right up to the trough and get his. Hell, there's so much of it, food, tractor, jeeps, clothes, ships, machine tools, factories even, that we could buy every congressman 10 times over and still have plenty of glue. With you on top, it still sounds as though you were looking for a fall guy, I told him. He again laughed merrily. Ha ha! Anywhere you fall in this surplus game, you'll still land soft and be in clover. What about it? Shall I phone the Pentagon? Sorry to stall you, I said, but I've got to think it over. I've got to talk to my lawyer. I'd still like to come down to Washington and study the angles. Angles? Hell, this hasn't any more angles than a big ripe watermelon. Brigadier General's not a bad title for a post-war use. When these GIs come back, they'll want to find soldiers running things. Okay, Winnie, I see your point. I'll tell the General you'll be coming down to look the ground over. You'll get the Order of Merit, of course. I've already got it, I informed him. The hell you say? That's wonderful. Well, then we'll fly you over to London or Brisbane and give you a couple of theater citations to dress you up. After a couple of weeks on Ike's or Mac's staff, you'll have a build-up like nobody's business. Then we make a killing. Bye. When the door closed behind General Forbes Dutton, I called for Arthurjean. Honey, I told her, get me a snort of brandy, and accept my personal apologies to the entire female sex for any time I have ever made use of the word whore. What's eating you, Winnie? She asked. I've just been propositioned by 2 gentlemen who would be complimented if you called them prostitutes, I told her. The only honest man I've met today was that first little guy. All he wanted me to do was to help reorganize the black market. Who's left now? There's only this one man who calls himself Charles G. Smith and has been waiting some time. He looks like a crank. Shall I give him a handout and tell him to go away? I shook my head. I can't take much more of the current brand of patriotism. Charles G. Smith was a small, wispy man with a protruding Adam's apple, buck teeth, and shabby clothes. He ignored my outstretched hand and advanced on me with a glittering eye. Mr. Tompkins, he announced in a curiously deep, velvety voice, you have made millions of dollars that you must soon leave behind you. You have invested years of your life in collecting and keeping those dollars. Little discs of metal, little slips of paper. What have you invested in the only thing you will be permitted to take with you when you leave? What do you mean? I asked. I mean your immortal soul, Mr. Tompkins, your immortal soul. said Mr. Charles G. Smith. "Oh, Lord, a religious crank," I exclaimed. "Naturally," he agreed proudly. "I'd rather be crazy about God than nuts about money. Why not?" I looked at him with growing respect. Why not indeed, I thought. "My case is out of your line, Mr. Smith," I told him. "They all say that," he replied. "But God doesn't think so." "My case is different," I repeated. "You see, I have not one, but two immortal souls." He nodded benignly. "I know," he said. "God told me that you were in trouble." "That sounds as though you and I were buddies, Mr. Smith," I observed. "Where can I find him? It will take God himself to straighten out my case." Smith shrugged his shoulders. "You can't find him," he said. "You've got to wait until he finds you." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. "Nonsense," Germaine said emphatically. Hers was the authoritative tone of a mother assuring her child that the lightning cannot possibly hit the house in a thunderstorm. "I don't see how you can call it nonsense," I told her. There he stood in my office, a little man with a big Adam's apple, telling me that God was on my track. I'm used to being followed by the FBI, but now this? She stretched out in her chaise lounge before the bedroom fire until I thought of the apostle who stated that the Lord delighteth not in any man's legs. Obviously he had never seen my wife's gams. "He sounds like a religious maniac," she observed. He admitted it, Jimmy. He was even proud of it. When he was standing there, he seemed to make more sense than most things that happen in Wall Street. He could be right. Germaine giggled. "If God finds you, Winnie," she said, "I hope he doesn't arrive it might be rather embarrassing." Again, the one-track mind, I remarked. "You don't suppose that sex is any news to the old man, do you? He invented it, darling." "You know, Winnie," she replied dreamily, "sometimes you are almost a poet. Just the same, if he came after me, I'd like to have him find me with a new hairdo." "So far as I am concerned," I told her, "it's just as well the old man didn't catch up with me on some recent occasions. He might have received a false impression of my eligibility for the club." "Pooh," Germaine marked with great decision. "He'd better not try any nonsense with you if I'm around. You're my Winning, and you're going to heaven right along with me if I have to cheat the customs." I yawned. I hope St. Peter will be suitably impressed. And not like those tough guys at the Port of New York. What I'd really like to get at is all this business about Von Bieberstein. I'd never heard of him till last week, and now it's got me jittery. Who he is, God only knows, and he hasn't tipped off the FBI. "I'm not very religious, darling," my wife said. "But from what I remember from Sunday school, God wasn't supposed to be a tattletale. He'll take care of Von Bieberstein, if there is such a person." I laughed. If there isn't, the FBI's going to look awfully silly when they come to write the history books. J. Edgar Hoover would turn over in his job at the very thought. "You know," she continued drowsily, "I think that Von Bieberstein is just a name they've given to all the things they can't solve. Like luck. You know the way people say, 'Bad luck.' Well, the FBI says, 'Von Bieberstein,' every time a ship sinks or a factory makes the wrong kind of shell. You wait and see, Winnie, and you'll find out I am right." "Speaking of luck," I asked, "what's the news from the kennels? Has Ponto met his fiancée yet? Or haven't the banns been published?" "Dalrymple seemed to think that it would be very easy to equip him with a suitable girlfriend," she said demurely. "It appears that there's a wartime shortage of sires or something. So I gather that there's no particular problem in Ponto's love life."
Dalrymple said we could come and get him the end of the week, Friday or Saturday. Poor dear. I think we ought to put orange blossoms in his dog biscuit when he gets home. I laughed. That's one load off my mind. I hope you're right and that it will steady him down. They say that the responsibilities of marriage do wonders for a young dog. It makes him respect property, maintain the social order, and vote the straight Republican ticket. Idiot. Yes, I'm thinking of running Ponto in the next election. He'd make a mighty fine governor, and he'd be sure to leave his mark in the Senate. Who knows? We might even elect him president. Germaine stretched again with considerable candor. Darling, she announced, you're dithering. Let's go to bed. Not until we get this religious argument straightened out, I objected. I think I owe it to Mr. Smith to make some kind of move. The politicians and the psychiatrists have failed me. There's only religion left. And besides, I still have half of my drink to finish. I put another birch log on the fire and watched as the flames brightened and cast a flickering glow on the canopy of my wife's bed. My idea's this, I told her. It's very undignified to sit around waiting for the old man to look me up, if he's really trying to find me, as Smith says. I think I'd better start a search party of my own. There are, no doubt, a lot of things he'll want to ask me about. And there are some points on which, damn it, I'm entitled to an explanation. You talk such rot, darling, she murmured. Wise gods never explain anything. It's take it or leave it. You just wait, you'll see. I'd like to know who Von Bieberstein is, just to get ahead of A.J. Harcourt. If the old man won't tell me that, at least I'm entitled to know who I am. You're my Winnie, she repeated, half asleep. I'll see that you get past the immigration authorities. I'll smuggle you in under my skirts, like Helen of Troy. St. Peter's far too respectable a man to try to see what I've got there. Now you're maudlin, I told her. From what I know of Greek costumes, Helen of Troy couldn't have smuggled a chihuahua into Troy under what she wore. Anyhow, these saints have X-ray eyes that can spot a sin right through skirt, girdle, and brassiere. Besides, I weigh too much. I'm much more like the unforgivable sin. Suppose I just pretend I lost my passport. It will be all right, darling, Germaine assured me. And if they won't let us into heaven, God knows they'll be delighted to put us up in hell. It would raise the value of real estate overnight. I can just hear the devil arguing with prospective tenants. We have such nice people in the next bed of coals. They're from Westchester, and the name's Tompkins. Any time a real estate agent urges you to take up residence, that's heaven, I told her. You dither delightfully, especially when you're half asleep. But I don't want to get into hell on false pretenses. It's not fair to the management. What I propose to do is to go out and see if I can't find the old man before he finds me, and see if I can't fix up my passport right now. As you say, it could be embarrassing otherwise. Then I'll march straight up to him, look him in the eye, and ask him what the hell he means. She sat up and held out her glass. More brandy, she ordered. I fixed her drink and my own and looked at the coals of the log fire. How are you going to set out? Germaine asked. No, don't laugh, darling. It might be quite important. You see, if we should have a child, it would be good to know. She paused, at a loss for words. It does sound crazy, doesn't it? I said. Middle-aged stockbroker cleans up in Wall Street, looks for God. Well, I suppose the best thing to do is to consult the clergyman. Then you'd better not start in Westchester, she advised. They're all bleeding celibates like poor old Ponto, or broadcloth men of affairs who shoot a darn good game of golf and never offend the vestryman. I'd try New York City if I were you, Winnie. They have the best architects, the best food, the best doctors, the best actors, and the best redheads in the world. They might even have the best clergymen. That doesn't follow, I told her, but I agree the chances are better there than up here.
I'm going to approach this thing scientifically, I continued. I'm going to pick a Protestant, probably a Presbyterian. Yes, she agreed. Do pick a Presbyterian. They build such lovely New England churches, and they believe in infant damnation. Or is that the Mormons? Shush, I rebuked her. As I was saying when you so rudely interrupted me, a Presbyterian. And they believe in predestination with only occasional leanings to infant damnation. And then I'll try a Jewish rabbi. I'm told that they are very highly educated men with a grasp of spiritual fundamentals, as well as a remarkable fund of practical knowledge. And, of course, a Catholic priest. Not Father Aloysius Murphy, Germaine besought me. I couldn't bear it if you consulted him. I don't know why, and of course I'm not a Catholic, but every time I hear him on the radio, I wish the Pope would send him as a missionary to Russia. Please don't pick any of these fashionable priests or rabbis, darling. Try to find simple, poor men who aren't trying to advertise themselves or raise money. I finished my drink and picked her up in my arms. It's long past bedtime, I told her. Here, drink it down and I'll put you to bed. I didn't know you gave a damn about religion, and here you are talking like a Joan of Arc or... She put her empty glass down on the bedside table and slipped out of her dressing gown. You don't know me very well, she said quietly. To you, I'm just your wife, not a separate person at all. And it's rather nice, but... No, I'm not religious, and heaven knows the saints would have hysterics if they heard you call me Joan of Arc. It's just that, well, I was brought up on church and Sunday school and the catechism, and forgot it all as soon as I graduated from Miss Spence's and had my coming out party. But they are all so proud and grand, these clergymen. They are so sure of themselves. I once went to an Easter service in Washington, it was at St. Thomas's, when the sermon was entirely devoted to a passionate plea for money, money, money. I've never met a clergyman yet who didn't hint that while the Lord loved my soul, the church would settle for cash. I suppose the churches need money like everybody else, I suggested. At least they don't charge admission like the movies. Oh, I know they need money, but they can't need money as much as people need goodness or God or whatever it is they do need. I'd like to find a single good, simple man who wasn't too sure of himself. Well, I can't explain. Get undressed and come to bed, darling. The sheets are bitterly cold. I chucked my clothes onto the chair by the fire. Hell, I exclaimed. That would be too awful. Germaine made a vague questioning noise. Suppose we are resurrected, not as we'd like to be, but as we are. You'd be safe. You'd have the build of an angel, and you'd be a knockout with wings. But I'd look like a ringer even in the best of halos. And with this weight, I'd need a terrific wing spread to get off the ground. Even then, I'd have to have a runway. I fixed the fire so it would keep burning for a couple of hours, and adjusted the fire screen so that there was no chance of a stray spark landing on the carpet. Then I crossed to the window overlooking the lawn and opened it on the cool spring night. The moon, now suspiciously less virginal in figure, but still shamelessly serene in silver, rode in the western sky, and the sense of spring drifted in on the light breeze. There was no sound save for the distant jingling of the peepers and the nearby rustle of the dry vines outside the window frame. I wish to God I knew who I am, I muttered. End of chapter 29.
Chapter 30 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. No doubt you'll be asking me to reconcile predestination and free will, observed Dr. Angus McGregor, minister of the 10th Presbyterian Church of Manhattan. That wasn't quite my question, sir, I replied. I asked you whether you could justify the Lord's putting my soul into another man's body, Am I to be responsible for the sins the other man committed?
Ah, Dr. McGregor remarked with relish. It is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. No doubt he kens what he's about. It will all be made known on the great day of judgment. Now, about predestination and free will. You'll have marked that many grand philosophers and divines have debated the point. 'Tis a nice point. 'Tis the theological pons osinorum.
Yes, I interrupted, but do you consider that I am bound by this body, or will I be returned to my own before I come to the judgment? And is my soul involved in another man's sins? Dr. McGregor drew a deep puff on his pipe.
Oh, aye, he declared. The principle of vicarious sacrifice has been observed ever since that ne'er-do-well Cain asked, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Aye, Mr. Tompkins, surely you are involved in the sins of others. Take your own case now. I believe your tale. Fearful and wonderful things have happened in this weary world before now by the will of the Lord. It is written by the Roman historian Tacitus that the pagan emperor Vespasian, that grand benefactor to whom the world owes the fine invention of the public comfort station, performed miracles in Egypt, making the blind to see and healing the cripples. These miracles are as well attested as any in Holy Scripture. If the Lord permitted to a heathen potentate these gifts of spiritual healing, can I deny that he might, for his own good reasons, permit your soul to inhabit another man's body?
But what is my moral responsibility in this predicament, Dr. McGregor? Where does my duty lie?
It is all related to yon matter of free will and predestination, he insisted. Your duty, man, is to fear the Lord and praise him. You will have taken this other man's wife, will you not? You will have taken his money and his home, his name and his business? Aye, if you take these, likely you will take his sins as well. Dinna believe that the Lord has no reason for all of this. Now, he continued, 'tis no great difficulty to reconcile free will and predestination.
I'm not a religious man, Doctor, I cut him off, but you have given me help. Will you accept a check for your church, say $1,000?
Aye, Mr. Tompkins, I will that. I canna help you, but I can only tell you to put your trust in the mercy and justice of the Lord. 'Tis all a man can do.
So I wrote out a check for $1,000 to the order of the 10th Presbyterian Church of Manhattan, and shook his hand. He thanked me.
Now, he announced, I must be on my way to comfort a poor body that's dying of the cancer. 'Tis an old lady, and she takes great comfort from her pain in the thought that she has been chosen by the Lord to suffer for the sins of others. 'Tis no a sound theology, mind you, but 'tis a mighty solace as her time comes nigh.
My next stop was at the office of Rabbi Benjamin De Silva of the Temple Ben David. Him I had located by consulting the classified telephone directory and had made an appointment to meet him in his study in the synagogue. He was a slender, quietly dressed young man, with the eager face of a scholar and the air of repose of a mystic. The walls of his room were lined with books, and as I noted Hebraic, Greek, Latin, and Arabic titles, as well as German, French, and English, I realized that I was dealing with a deeply cultured man. His voice was musical and low as he asked me to be seated. Rabbi De Silva, I began, before I begin, I would like to ask you to accept, on behalf of your congregation, a gift of $1,000 as a token of my gratitude for consenting to hear my story. Perhaps you can help me, perhaps not. As you realize, I am not of your faith, but I need your wisdom. I am trying to find my soul.
So are we all, Mr. Tompkins,
the rabbi assured me.
What is your problem?
I recited the events, which made it imperative for me to recollect the events prior to April 2nd. I told him of the reasons that convinced me that I, Frank Jacklin, was living in Winfred Tompkins' body. I outlined the moral and personal problems involved in this confusion of personalities. I indicated the psychiatric and other tests that had been made. Naturally, I did not mention the Alaska, the thorium bomb, Z2, or von Bieberstein. When I had completed my account, Rabbi Da Silva gazed abstractedly at the small coal fire which smoldered in the grate of his study. "Why did you come to me, Mr. Tompkins?" he asked. "Because I hoped that in your studies of the human soul you might have found knowledge that would help me." He sat silent for some minutes. "For many centuries," he began at last, "there has been a curious belief among you Christians that the Jewish rabbinate possesses mystical knowledge of the occult. No doubt that belief derives from the early Middle Ages, when the Jews became, in part, the means by which the science and culture of the Saracen East was brought to the ignorant, barbarous West. That service was turned against us by the superstitions and prejudices of Christendom, and we were regarded as akin to sorcerers and witch-masters. Even today in Germany, we are paying for our crime of having brought enlightenment to Europe in the Dark Ages." "Then you can't help me?" I asked. "I did not say so, Mr. Tompkins," the rabbi replied. "Certainly I cannot help you in any occult manner. I cannot pick a book from the shelves, mutter a few words in Hebrew, and resolve your spiritual problems with a whiff of brimstone. The casting out of devils is not included in Judaism. Indeed, it has gone out of fashion in Christendom." "What do you suggest?" I inquired. "Many important events, including the possible capture of a dangerous Nazi spy, depend on my recovering my memory." "Even with that inducement," the rabbi remarked with an ironic smile, "I am not in a position to urge any particular course on you. Assume, for the sake of argument, that you are the victim of what is called a demonic possession, Mr. Tompkins. Are you sure that you would be benefited by casting out the soul of Frank Jacklin and resuming command of your own personality? Is not Winfred Tompkins a better and happier man under the influence of Jacklin than he was as himself? In other words, Mr. Tompkins, you may not be seeking to cast out a devil at all, but an angel of the Lord. Of course, I am speaking in moral metaphor, and not as a scientist or a theologian. My advice to you would be to ignore your loss of memory and live out your life as best you can, and be thankful that whatever it is that caused this change has been for your betterment and has brought happiness to others." I shook my head. "I know that I am foolish to insist, Rabbi Da Silva," I said. "What you say is just about what the psychiatrist advised. Yet I must open that locked door and see what is hidden in the secret room." Da Silva smiled gently. "Yes," he agreed, "I see that you must. Bluebeard's wife felt much the same, and the charm and universal meaning of that great fable is that humanity must always open the closed doors, even at the risk of destruction. All wisdom urges us to leave well enough alone, yet our instinct is wiser than wisdom itself. God bless you, Mr. Tompkins, and may you come to no harm if you find the key to this locked room." "Thank you, sir," I said. "Now there remain only the Catholics. Perhaps a parish priest." "I shall be very much surprised if a priest advises you differently, Mr. Tompkins," the rabbi observed. "Drop in again sometime and tell me, will you?" I gave him his check for the Temple Ben David and went on to the rectory of St. Patrick's by the gas house, where I asked for the priest. "Sure, Father Flanagan's celebrating Mass," the aged housekeeper rebuked me. "I'll wait," I told her. "I have a contribution for the church. I must give it to him personally." "Glory be," she remarked, and withdrew, muttering. Father Flanagan was a burly, well-built young Irish-American with a friendly smile and a crushing handshake. "Mrs. Casey tells me you have something for the church, Mr. "My name's Tompkins, Father. I have a check for $1,000. I'll give it to you now. There are no strings to it, but I'd like to ask you to help me." "Well, I'll be. You know, Mr. Tompkins," Father Flanagan told me, "just this morning at breakfast, Mrs. Casey said she was praying that we'd finish raising the money for the new altar before the bishop's visit. And here it is. Isn't that wonderful now?" "There you are, Father," I told him, "and welcome to it." "Thank you, Mr. Tompkins," the priest said simply. I shall remember you in my prayers. And so, no doubt, shall Mrs. Casey. You're not a Catholic, of course?"
"No," I replied. "I don't seem to be anything that makes sense medically, legally, or morally. I need help." So I told him the whole story from beginning to end, and added the advice I had already received from Dr. McGregor and Rabbi De Silva. Father Flanagan heard me out and then considered carefully.
"I've heard some strange things in confession," he stated at last, "but they never taught us at Notre Dame how to deal with a problem like yours. I'd rather like to consult the bishop before I undertook to advise you. Do you mind?"
"Yes, I do," I told the priest. "It's no disrespect for you, Bishop. It's just that I feel that this problem must be solved on a low level rather than by the higher echelons. In the Navy, we soon learned that the best way to get a problem loused up was to refer it to CINCPAC. What is your own reaction to my story?" Father Flanagan pursed his lips and pondered for a moment.
"Speaking as a man," he said, "and not as a priest, it looks to me as though you were sitting pretty, Mr. Tompkins. Naturally, I have no explanation for it, and the psychiatrists seem to have given you a clean bill of health, so maybe you're not crazy. I have a vague idea that there's reference to something like your experience in the patristic writings which I read when I was studying for the priesthood. It's all mixed up with the Gnostics and necromancy, but it's hard to tell how much you can accept literally in that material. Pagan literature is full of it, such as Apuleius's The Golden Ass, in which a witch turns a man into a donkey, but that's admittedly fancy. As I say, you seem to be sitting pretty. By your own account, Commander Jacklin's life was pretty much of a failure, and Tompkins was not exactly what you could call a huge moral success. Yet you, as Jacklin, seem to be doing a pretty good job with Tompkins' life. Why don't you let it go at that?"
"I can't, Father," I told him. "I've got to find out what Tompkins was doing just before Easter. Even if it's only for that 1 week, I've got to know."
"And you say that so far nobody has been able to help you?"
"Nobody," I replied. "The doctors call it trauma and say that my memory may come back to me at any time, but I can't wait." He smiled.
"Can't is a big and human word. Have you tried hypnotism? Or scopolamine? They aren't exactly liturgical, and my bishop would have a fit if he heard me mention them. He considers them on a par with mediums and spiritualism. But they have some value in restoring memory."
I slapped my knee. "Thanks, Father!" I exclaimed. "You've given me an idea. I'll try a medium." The priest looked grave.
"I wouldn't do that now, if I were you, Mr. Tompkins," he told me. "That kind of thing is too close to black magic and devil worship for decent men to play with."
"I hope I don't shock you, Father Flanagan," I replied, "but if God can't help me, I'll have to go to the devil."
"I shall pray for you, Mr. Tompkins," the priest said.
End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Rad Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After I left St. Patrick's by the gas house, I went to a corner saloon and telephoned the FBI. I asked for Harcourt, but was told that he was out to lunch, which reminded me that I was hungry. A private treaty with the bartender brought me a steak sandwich and no questions asked. Apple pie and coffee followed, and were not too horrible. I smoked a cigarette, drank a second cup of coffee, and called the FBI again. This time Harcourt had returned from lunch, and he talked as though he had swallowed the revised statutes of the United States, but that they gave him indigestion. "See here, Andy," I told him at last. "I'm not looking for legal advice. I want to consult a medium, any medium. If I picked one out of the phone book, you'd have the headache of checking on her, as I suppose you're checking on the clergyman I saw this morning. So this time, just save yourself the trouble and tell me who I should see."
"The Bureau doesn't endorse spiritualists."
he informed me, but the old J. Edgar Hoover spirit was running thin and his heart wasn't in it. I'm not asking the Bureau to endorse anything, not even a candy laxative, I replied. Just you tell me the name and address of one reasonably respectable medium, and I'll take care of the rest. And don't pretend that the Bureau has no record of mediums in New York City. Mr. Tompkins, he said, and I could fairly hear the hum of the recording machine on the telephone, the Bureau does not endorse any so-called spiritualist mediums. Naturally, under the leadership of our present director, the New York office has made a close check on all self-styled spiritualistic mediums in this city. One of these, who has established her bona fides, for purposes of identification only, is Madame Claire LeLune, 1187 Lenox Avenue. 1187 Lenox, I repeated after him. That's in Harlem. Madame Claire LeLune sounds like the dark side of the moon to me. Say, Andy, hasn't she a friend named Pierrot? There was a pause at the other end of the wire. No, sir, Mr. Tompkins, came the FBI official voice. Okay, I told him. I suppose you'll have to check on her as on everybody else, but I wanted you to start calling the shots so as to save trouble for all of us. I'm going to consult Madame Lune, so you can tell your agents to rendezvous at 1187 Lenox Avenue. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. 1187 Lenox did not seem prepossessing from the spiritual angle. Madame LeLune's apartment was on the 3rd floor, walk up, and smelled of cabbage, diapers, and African sweat. Madame LeLune herself was a light mulatto with a superb figure and a face so deeply scarred by smallpox that it looked like a map of southern lynchings since 1921. She seemed reluctant to deal with me on a professional basis, even after I had offered her a $20 bill, until I told her that the FBI had recommended her and that I needed her help. "Oh," she said, "that's different. Just you wait till I turn down my stove." She ushered me into a close and smelly little room with black velvet curtains and a couch covered with black sateen. Madame LeLune lay down on the couch and directed me to turn off the electric light from the switch by the door. Although it was still early afternoon, the room was so dark that I could barely make out the form of the medium or find my way back to the chair. For a time there was no sound except for the deep, regular breathing of the medium. Then suddenly came the shrill voice of a pickaninny. "I's here," the voice cried. "It's Silver Bell, mammy. I's here." I smiled to myself in the Harlem dusk. It was so obviously the usual racket. There was the medium in her 10-cent trance. The voice of her control was coming through. I had only to ask and I would receive a vague and blotting paper reply to any question. "I's here, mammy," the child's voice repeated. "What you want, mammy? Silver Bell's here." Madame LeLune snorted and snored on the couch. My eyes had become more accustomed to the dim light, and I noticed how she had loosened her blouse so that her superb bust rose in twin-peaked Kilimanjaro against the wall. "Silver Bell's here, mammy," the child's voice said again. "What you want?" "I want," I said, "to speak to Frank Jacklin. He died in the North Pacific about 3 weeks ago." There was a pause, during which the snorting breaths of the medium were the only sound in the smelly little room. Then the child's voice rose, shrill and petulant. "You funnin', mammy, you funnin'. They ain't no Jacklin over here. Jacklin ain't dead. Jacklin's sittin' right by your side, mammy. He police, mammy, he police." Madame LeLune stirred, and I sensed her sightless eyes turning toward me in the dark. "No, I'm not police, Silver Bell," I said. "If you can't find Jacklin, I want to speak to Winnie Tompkins." For several minutes there was a long silence. Then came an impish giggle. "Here's Mr. Tompkins, mammy, but my, he do look funny. He don't look like he used to look." Again silence.
Here he is, Mammy. Here he is. What do you want to know? Ask him, I said, whether he is well and happy. The hair rose on the back of my neck and a slow shiver ran down my spine as the answer came. The answer was the familiar barking of a dog, deep, strong, savage. Is that you, Ponto? I asked. The answering bark came, woof, woof. Where is Mr. Tompkins? More woofs. Where is Commander Jacklin? Silence. Are you alive? Woof, woof. Am I alive? Silence. Is your name Ponto? Where is von Bieberstein? I demanded, but my question was drowned in a storm of barking. I's tired, Mammy, came the child's voice. Silverbell's tired. The voice trailed off, leaving me in the stifling little Harlem parlor with the mulatto woman snoring. I sat, bemused, in the straight-back chair across the room from her. My eyes had now got used to the thin light that filtered around the heavy black curtain. I noticed a fleck of white about the corners of her mouth, and I made silent note of the way her body heaved with its tortured breathing. After a while, she stirred. You there, Mr. Tompkins? Yes, I'm here. You find out what you want? She inquired. I found out that you're a fraud, I told her. You're welcome to my money, but I'm damned if I think you've earned it. She sat up and adjusted her clothing calmly. What for you say that, Mr. Tompkins? She demanded. Spirits come, spirits go. You ask questions. Maybe they give you the answers. I don't know. Very clever, Madame Laloon, I observed. Harcourt phones you, I'm on the way, and tells you what to do. I'm supposed to come in and swallow it all. Well, I'm not interested in that game. All I want to know is how you managed to imitate my dog. Madame Laloon rose and peered at me in the dusk. White man, she said, what dog you talking about? I ain't seen no dog. The words I had planned to fling at her died in my throat. Fraud or not, she was superb. Her pockmarked face had a haughty dignity, and her bearing was that of a great queen. I'm sorry, I apologized, without knowing why. I'm in trouble. I hoped you could help me. All I got out of your trance was a child laughing and a dog barking. Her eyes glowed in the twilit room. What this dog? She demanded. You know this dog? Yes, I told her. It's my dog. His name is Ponto. He's a Great Dane, and he's at the kennels. You go, Mr. Tompkins, she ordered me. You better go fast. That dog, what's his color now? Black, I said. Yes, black. She rolled her eyes until I saw the whites. That black dog don't mean no good to you or yours. You keep away from that dog, Mr. Tompkins. No, sir, I don't want your money. There's no luck with you, white man, with that black dog. I don't know how I knows, but I does know. As I walked out into the bright, cool air of Lenox Avenue, I felt relieved. Madame Laloon was an interesting enough type. She obviously had the primitive sense of second sight, intuition, whatever it is, that let her penetrate behind human appearances. The medium business was just a trade trick. In Africa or Haiti, she could have been a witch doctor with a pet snake. In New Orleans, even, she would be a voodoo princess. Here in Harlem, she had become a medium. Of course, she was a fraud. But how had she imitated the barking of the Great Dane? Then I laughed so loudly that a passing colored man sheered violently away from me. Of course, that was it. I had been right all the time. This was Harcourt's work. He had recommended Madame Laloon to me, and then told her how to behave. Damn his insolence! I stopped dead, and only stirred when the violent and prolonged sounding of an automobile horn reminded me that I was standing in the middle of a cross street. How did Harcourt know about Ponto when he had never seen him? And how could he tell the medium how to imitate Ponto's bark? On the next corner was a dive.
a saloon that advertised attractions and from whose doors welled the jungle thumping of Harlem jazz. I slipped in and sat down at a corner table. A tall colored girl whose scanty white silk blouse was not designed to conceal anything came over and leaned down to take my order. "What you want, honey man?" she asked sullenly. The band on the platform let loose with a blast of traps and trombone. "Let's dance," I said. She nodded with a curious dignity, and I found myself parading, dipping and swaying around a tiny dance floor, while the black girl pressed her body against me despairingly. I pulled off to the side and led her back to my table. "Why do you do this?" I asked. She said nothing. "You need money?" I asked. She still said nothing. "Here," I said. I pulled out my checkbook and wrote out a check for $1,000 payable to cash. "This is for you," I told her. "Take it and do whatever you want to do. The check's good." The girl looked at me, took the check, studied it. Then she rose in complete silence, looked at me again, and left me. She shrugged her way through the dancers and the waiters to the rear of the room and disappeared. I did not know her name, and I never saw her again. A high ochre girl came over. "Change your luck?" she asked, bending over so that I could see down the front of her scant-cut dress. "My luck's done changed," I told her. "Give me a drink, and here's a 10 spot for yourself, and I'll be on my way." She tucked the bill down the front of her dress. "May you have good luck, man," she said gravely. As she said it, her eyes widened and her mouth hung open. "God," she muttered, "the black dog's following you," and fled. "I know," I said to the room at large, and left without waiting for my drink. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I walked down Lenox Avenue to the first cigar store and telephoned the office. As soon as I was connected with Arthurjean, I asked her to meet me at her apartment as soon as she could make it. Then I hailed a cab and was driven south through Central Park to the Upper East 50s and my secretary's apartment. She was waiting. "Gee, honey," she exclaimed, "I just got here. What's cooking?" I followed her in and went straight to the kitchenette. I poured myself a stiff drink and downed it rapidly. I poured myself another and turned to see her staring at me. "You look terrible," she told me. "What's happened to you?" "I can't tell you," I replied. "You'd think I'm crazy and you'd turn me in." "I will not." She came up close to me and looked me square in the eye. "I don't care if you're crazy as a bedbug," she announced. "Go on and spit it out in Mama's hand. I won't squeal." "Sit down," I ordered, "and get yourself a drink first. This is tough." She sat and listened quietly as I outlined the latest developments. "So you see," I concluded, "I can't tell anyone. They'd have me locked up for keeps." She nodded. "Yeah," she agreed. "I can see that. Maybe your wife—" "I couldn't tell her," I contradicted. "It would be too damn cruel just now when she's really happy." Arthurjean sat and thought for a while. "Yep," she remarked, as though she had just concluded a long argument. "You're right. You can't tell anybody that. How about this nosy A.J. Harcourt? Won't he find out? He's still having you tailed." "I don't see how he could," I told her, "unless that Madame Laloon is a complete phony, which doesn't make sense. She and I were alone in the room. If it was a plant, there's nothing to tell. If she's on the level, she won't remember what went on." "That's no plant," Arthurjean Briggs announced. "It wouldn't make sense for the FBI to pull it. Harcourt sent you there in the first place, but he wouldn't put her up to a trick like that." "He'll be hot on my trail then," I said. "All those clergymen I saw will have to be checked, when all the time—" "Do you know what I'd do if I was you?" she said abruptly. I'd get rid of that damn dog, but fast. You mean sell it? I asked. I mean kill it. It isn't natural acting that way. It's been worrying you nigh crazy. That's what it's been doing. You just take it to the vets and have it chloroformed. They do it all the time on account of the rabbis. Rabies, I corrected. That's right. But they do it, don't they? You don't have to get permission. He's your property. You can tell the vet he bit you. I started up. Hell, I exclaimed. I've got to get him away from the kennels fast. It's... Arthurjean put her large, strong hand on my shoulder. There, honey, she soothed me. It's all right. It's going to be all right. I looked at her and realized that she hadn't believed a word of my story. See here, I began, when the doorbell rang. 2-1 it's Harcourt, I remarked. I hope so, said Arthurjean, coloring faintly. Well, what's all this about? I demanded, as a slow blush gathered in sunset fury upon her pleasant face. Why, Arthurjean, lay off, she begged. He's a nice guy, and he hasn't got that family in Brooklyn he kept talking about. You and me are washed up, and, well, he's from the South too, and he talks my language. Good luck, I told her, but he's also on the doorstep, so take hold of yourself. He was, she did. Evening, Miss Briggs, the special agent said politely. Any luck, Mr. Tompkins? I shook my head. He looked reproachful. Oh, come now, he pleaded. Something must have happened. You got out of Harlem like a bat out of hell and almost shook the agent who was tailing you. You don't look to me like nothing happened. Have you filled in that gap? Started to remember anything? On my word of honor, Andy, I swore, I haven't remembered a thing. The gap's still there. He said nothing for a few minutes and exchanged a glance with Arthurjean. Something must have happened, he requested. You've changed. Come clean, can't you? I'm only trying to help you. I can't tell you much of anything, I told him. You wouldn't believe me if I did. There's been a sort of locked door inside my mind for the last 3 weeks. Now the door's unlocked and it's beginning to swing open. I haven't looked inside, but I think I know what I'll find. I can't tell you more than that now. But you're going to look, aren't you? He asked. I've got to look, I said. He sighed. Well, we'll just have to keep an eye on you so as to be around when you do. See here, Mr. Tompkins, you know your own business, but this Von Bieberstein guy is nobody to monkey around with. He's plenty tough, and he'd as soon kill as sneeze. Can't you give me a hint? I'm trained to take those risks and know how to take care of myself. And anyhow, the Bureau is back of me. I leaned back in my chair and laughed and laughed and laughed until I noticed that both Arthurjean and Harcourt were staring at me without smiling. Sorry, I apologized. It's just that something struck me as rather funny. Well, Arthurjean, I'll be catching the train back to Westchester. You and Andy blow yourself to a dinner at my expense. I'll go down to the vet's first thing in the morning and follow your advice. Good night, Andy. I'll be seeing you. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom and slept alone. Germaine was worried, but I put her aside with the explanation that I had a splitting headache. Too much to drink, probably, was my explanation. The truth was that I didn't want to see or talk to my wife so that she could not guess the perfectly appalling knowledge that had come to me. This was insane, I repeated to myself. Even Arthurjean Briggs, who had sworn never to turn me in, had not believed it. Yet no other explanation was open to me. The dog's whole conduct since that fatal afternoon of April 2nd was consistent only with the utterly irrational theory that the body of the Great Dane had been possessed by the soul of Winnie Tompkins at the very moment when the latter's body, now mine, had been possessed by the soul of Frank Jacklin. Everybody had a fairly nice set of words for the latter phenomenon. Trauma, schizophrenia, neurasthenia, the will of God. And the best advice was uniform. Forget about it.
It will wear off in time. Take things easy. You've been working too hard. Everybody's crazy. Now, just imagine trying to convince the FBI or a psychiatrist that in addition to this delusion, you know for a fact that a Great Dane is now inhabited by the soul that once resided in your own body. I could hear the clanging of the gong on the private ambulance as it raced me to the nearest asylum. I could feel my arms already in the straitjacket. No one must ever know. Arthurjean must never tell. If she doubted me, she must never tell. The way I figured it was this. Winnie had been asleep at the Pond Club. He had been worried about Ponto, and Ponto was desperately ill, dying even, from distemper. Both of their, their ids, or psyches, were relaxed, weakened, off guard. Then, the atomic explosion in the Aleutians by some freak had hurled my soul halfway around the world into the sleeping body of Winnie Tompkins. His soul had then crowded into the body of Ponto. Ponto's soul, if dogs have them, which I don't doubt, was out of luck, permanently withdrawn. Crazy? I'll say. I was the only person alive who knew that it was true, and nobody would ever believe me, if only for the reason that it would always be much simpler to lock me up. Quite obviously, Ponto knew that he was Winnie and resented my presence in his home. He had shown the jealousy and ill temper natural to a man instead of the friendliness of a dog. He had been humanly jealous of Germaine. Suddenly I chuckled. By George, this was rich. Winnie, in turn, undoubtedly believed that I was Ponto. The Jacqueline angle was outside of his range. No wonder he was furious with me when he saw that his household pet, a Great Dane, masquerading in his human body, had usurped his place in the affections of his wife and authority over his home. Only hunger, which brings all things to terms, had broken his rebellion against this monstrous confusion. It must be tough to find yourself reduced to dog biscuits and runs on the lawn. I knew what I must do. Arthurjean had been right. The only way I could make myself secure was to have Ponto killed. Would this be murder? I wondered what Father Flanagan would make of it. Probably he would say, "Yes, it is murder if you believe that Winfred Tompkins is Ponto." Yet, until Ponto was dead, there could be no security for me. At any moment, if the psychiatrist were right, the change might come with a small shock, and Winnie Tompkins would resume lawful possession of his body, his home, his wife, his money, while I, Commander Frank Jacqueline, USNR, could count myself lucky to be allowed to sleep on a smelly old blanket on the floor in the corner and eat dog biscuits and be offered as a thoroughbred sire. There was still time to stop that nonsense. The strictly practical thing to do was to go to the kennels first thing in the morning. Then I'd take Ponto away from Dalrymple and drive down to White Plains and find a vet to give him chloroform. Thus, I would be safe from the possibility of having Winnie reoccupy his body and drive me into Ponto's, or, worse still, into the stratosphere to join the mild chemical mist that was all that remained of the body of Frank Jacqueline. All right, it was murder then. I would be murdering Winnie Tompkins. But I would be the only one who would know it. The perfect crime. I laughed to myself at the thought that now Harcourt would lose his last chance to learn what Winnie had done in that fateful week before Chalmis's thorium bomb had blown me and the Alaska into the Aurora Borealis. Although it was a cool night, I was perspiring violently. My nerves were shot to pieces. After this, I would need a rest. Winnie's business was in good shape. I could afford to keep away from the office for a time, until I grew a new face, as it were, after this shattering discovery. Then Jimmy and I, perhaps we would have a child. I'd be damned if I'd let my son be a stockbroker with a Great Dane. I might even take the ambassadorship to Canada. The Forbes-Dutton scheme sounded too raw even for Washington. It would backfire into another Teapot Dome. I drew a deep breath and relaxed in my bed. My course was plain. First of all, I'd attend to Ponto, burn my canine bridges behind me. Then, I'd take Dr. Folsom at his word and go to the sanctuary for a couple of weeks. My nerves were shot to pieces, and if I didn't tell him or Pendergrast Potter about this latest wrinkle in transmigration, they would have no reason for detaining me against my will. Oh yes, I'd have to see that Rutherford got his money. Murray Vail was still in Hartford, damn him and his nurse. Well, the thing to do was to stop off at Rutherford's office on the way to the kennels and give him a check. Vail could fix up the papers later. Once Ponto was dead, I could relax. Was it murder? Well, that depended on how you look at it. Certainly, I was doing a better job of managing Winnie's life than he had done or could do. Look how I straightened out his mess with women and had made Germaine happy for the first time in her life. Look at the killing I had made in Wall Street. 3 million smackers just by using my head. Look at the way I had sold myself to the authorities at Washington, except for the State Department. The happiness and welfare of too many people now depended on my staying in charge of operations instead of Winnie Tompkins. Here at least was one case where the end justified the means, and nobody could call it murder. And anyhow, chloroform is an easy death. You choke and gag a bit at first, but then it's all easy, like falling off a log. You just go to sleep and never wake up. It would be the kindest possible exit for a man who had done no good in the world. I drifted off to sleep. I awakened with a start, as though a voice had summoned me. The moonlight was streaming through the bedroom window. I knew what I must do. I got out of bed, crossed the room to the clothes closet, felt over in the corner until my fingers found the knothole in the smooth pine lining. I pressed, and there was a click. I reached down and lifted the sloping shelf for shoes. There, underneath it, lay a small, neatly docketed file. There were many papers, and the record went back for years. I switched on the light and examined the contents of the envelope marked thorium. It was all there. The ship, the names, the ports, the mission. There was documentation on Jacqueline. I ran through it. It was accurate and included a specimen of my signature. There was a cross-reference to Chalmers and a small file on someone named Kaplansky. Irreverently included was a folder which contained 3 cards labeled Retreat, Holy Week, St. Michael, and Stations of X. I crossed to the fireplace and put the papers in the grate. For an hour I sat there feeding the flames with the record of betrayal and infamy. Names, places, dates. I glanced at them, forgot them, and burned them with rising exultation. Thank God that load was off my conscience. I might have to answer for Winnie's sins, but I was damned if I'd be responsible for his crimes. And the killing of Ponto was no longer to be murder. It was an execution. For Ponto was Tompkins, and Tompkins was von Bieberstein. Dawn was beginning to smudge the windows when the last paper had been burned, and the ashes crushed to fragments beyond the power of reconstruction by forensic science. Without Winnie, the organization of his gulls and dupes would fall apart, and the thing that had been von Bieberstein would cease to exist. Another thing was clearer, too. Winnie Tompkins had had an obsession about Jacqueline. Finally, through some combination of fatigue and mental shock, a Jacqueline personality had taken control. Call it schizophrenia, Jekyll and Hyde, or whatever. There was a fair chance that I was still Winnie, but his better self. The dog had been another obsession. The dog was to blame? Well, if I believed it, it might be true, like the old scapegoat system. I was physically the same man who had been von Bieberstein and had blown up the Alaska, planting evidence that would throw the blame on Jacqueline. In my heart and spirit, it was as though I had been recreated. All the evidence had been destroyed. I switched off the light and returned to bed.
I fell asleep almost at once, for now I knew that I would be safe and that Germain would be safe. There was no record left, and soon Ponto too would be gone. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Wednesday the 25th dawned bright and fair. My mind was fully made up, and I was feeling fine. Germaine was still anxious about me at breakfast, but I soon convinced her that there was nothing serious involved. I laughed secretly as I said it. You know, I told her, I think I'll drive over to Hartford and have those people at the sanctuary look me over again. I think I need some kind of rest. The reaction, you know. My wife raised no objection. In fact, she seemed rather relieved, as though my aloof conduct of the previous night had been a shock to her self-confidence. I'll stop off at the kennels on my way over, I added, just to make sure that Ponto is all right. My plan was to remove the dog and drive to White Plains. Then, if there was any issue raised as to my need for a rest cure, it would appear that I had inexplicably ordered my favorite dog chloroformed. That would clinch it with Germaine, as nothing else would. She seemed rather subdued as she went upstairs and helped me pack my things in a suitcase. She did not offer to kiss me goodbye as I drove the Packard out of the garage and rolled around the gravel drive toward my road to freedom. First, of course, I stopped at Dr. Rutherford's office. It was early in the morning and he hadn't finished breakfast. The maid admitted me to the reception room, and while waiting for him I made out a check for $15,000 to the order of Jeremiah Rutherford and marked across the back, "For professional services." "Here you are, Jerry," I informed him when he finally appeared. I would have got it to you sooner, except that my lawyer went off the deep end with a girl in Hartford. He should have had the papers ready on Monday, and here it is Wednesday. "Thanks," he said briefly. "Are you feeling okay?" he asked. "You look a bit shaky." I laughed. "Set it down to my liver," I told him. "I had a wet night last night, and I'm a little rocky this morning. As a matter of fact, I think I'll run over to the sanctuary and ask Folsom to put me up for a few days. My nerves are shot to hell." "Good idea," he murmured absently. "I'll go down to the bank and put this in for collection. My Army papers came through yesterday, and I'm all set." I climbed into the car and tooled along the roads until, after inquiring at a couple of filling stations, I located Dalrymple's kennels. "I've come for Ponto," I told the vet. Dalrymple seemed rather embarrassed. "Are you sure you need him?" he asked. "He's just served Bugle Bell III. That's the prize-winning brindle bitch owned by one of the Fortune editors. And I was planning—" "You can cancel your plans," I told him. "And as for Bugle Bell's pups, I'll buy the litter. What were your other plans, anyhow?" Dalrymple was quite abashed. "Not exactly anything, Mr. Tompkins, sir," he said. "It was only that—" I nodded majestically. "Once is enough," I said. "And you can be thankful I don't report you to the Kennel Club for bootlegging thoroughbred puppies. Ponto comes with me now." "Yes, sir, Mr. Tompkins," the vet agreed humbly. Dalrymple was a broken man, but Ponto was not a broken dog. However, marriage coming so soon after distemper had curbed his spirit, and he slouched into the Packard. As soon as I was out on the main road again, I stepped on the accelerator, heading the car southward in the general direction of White Plains. Ponto sat panting on the seat beside me, but in his weary eye I saw all the Westchester stockbrokers who had ever annoyed me. I also saw Winnie, and Winnie was to die. I admit that I was daydreaming a bit as I rounded the turn. In any case, I was driving fast and had not fully accustomed myself to handling the Packard. The other automobile backed violently out of the driveway on the right, the dope of a driver not looking to see if there was any traffic coming. I slapped my foot down on the brake, missed, and hit the accelerator. The Packard gave a wild leap ahead. The other car, a battered old Chevrolet, completely blocked the road. I jammed on the handbrake and twisted the steering gear so that the Packard ran up the bank of an elderly apple tree. My head snapped forward. There was a blinding flash, and then complete blackness. Seconds or centuries later, I opened my eyes. The old Chevy seemed to have pulled away and was now parked ahead of us along the right-hand side of the road. My windshield had not shattered, and so far as I could see, no major damage had been done to my car, though I hated to think of the fenders. I ached in every limb. My neck itched intolerably, so I scratched it with my left leg. I shook myself. "Well, I'll be damned," I exclaimed, only to hear a deep growl that seemed to originate from within my hairy chest. I glanced over my shoulder. There, in the seat beside me, hunched forward over the steering wheel, sat a heavy-built man, a thin trickle of blood sliding down his cheek, his eyes closed and his lips open, while he snorted with concussion. Instinctively, I called for help. My reward was a series of loud, angry barks. Again my ear itched, and I scratched it again with my left leg. It seemed that I had become a dog. The man beside me stirred and moaned. Then he opened his eyes. "Ponto," he said dreamily. "Good dog." The driver of the other car walked back and was standing by the window. "You all right, mister?" he asked. "You was doing 50 easy. Lucky for you, I see you coming." The man in the driver's seat gave a feeble smile. "My fault," he admitted. "I was daydreaming. Lucky this heap has good brakes. Are you all right? Any damage, I mean?" The other man laughed. "Sure," he said. "I'll go on now, just so you're all right. Want a doc?" "Uh-uh." The man on the seat beside me shook his head. "My name's Tompkins and I live in Bedford Hills. If there's any damage, it's my fault and I'll pay for it." "Sure you're okay?" "Yep," agreed the owner of the Chevrolet. "You got a cut or something. Reckon you ought to see a doc." "I will," said the man beside me. "Don't worry, I'll be all right. Just bumped my head a bit." We waited until the Chevrolet had rattled itself around the turn of the road. Then the man cautiously tried the gears and disinfiltrated the Packard from the apple tree. He got out and inspected the car carefully for damage, and then climbed back behind the steering wheel. I started to ask him a question. It was a whine. "Why, Ponto," he exclaimed. "You old black devil. How are you, hound? Long time no see." "Hot damn," he exclaimed after a pause. "Have I been on a drunk? You know, Ponto, I dreamed that I was you, and if there's anything in dreams, I bet I'm the only Republican in Westchester County that ever married a brindle bitch named Buglebell. Let's see," he continued. "Where were we? Earlier today I went to the Pond Club and had a couple of drinks. How in hell do I find myself here? I must have drawn one hell of a blank, Ponto. The damnedest blank I've ever drawn in my life." His eyes looked down on the seat beside us where I had left a copy of the morning New York Times. "Hello," he exclaimed. "That's funny. Here it is. Good Lord, the 25th of April. So I've been out for 3 weeks. That is a blank to end all blanks." He whistled tunelessly between his teeth. Then he cast a glance toward the back seat where my suitcase rested. "What gives?" he inquired. "I'm not leaving home, for God's sake. Ponto, old boy, you just stick by me and we'll go back to the house and see what this is all about." "Yes," I barked at him. "That's a good dog," he said affably. "That's a good Ponto." He backed the Packard into the driveway that had been my nemesis and turned the car around. As we approached the house, he slowed the car to a dead stop. "Ponto," he told me, "here's where you and I go to a committee of the whole. What's been going on around here? There's been one hell of a mix-up if you ask me. I had a dream—" The sooner I got his mind off this subject, the safer I would be. I laid my ears back and woofed. "Attaboy," he agreed. "Now, let's take a look at this paper. What? Roosevelt's dead? Why doesn't anybody tell me these things? And Germany's about to flop? Who would have dreamed it? You know, Hound, I feel like Rip Van Winkle coming back after 20 years' sleep. I tried to look ingratiating and let my tongue loll fetchingly out of the side of my mouth.
Say, he exclaimed harshly, now it's beginning to come back. You took my place while I was... God, have you ever been introduced to a great big dog and told she's your wife? Well, damn it, you and Jimmy? Oh, hell, this is one god-awful mess. What's been happening around here anyhow? Am I going nuts?
I pricked up my ears and gave a false, loving whine. I licked his stinking hands.
Okay, Winnie agreed. It's not your fault. But what the hell happened is beyond me. I hate to think of those prime asses, Phil and Graham, in this market. And what happened to Virginia? That's one gal you didn't know about, Ponto. She's for me, and how?
And he took another look at the paper.
Oh, the hell with it, he growled. If Jimmy doesn't like it, she knows what she can do about it. Let's go home, Ponto, and just tell her man to man where she gets off.
I barked. He put his foot on the accelerator and whirled up the drive to come to a stop in front of Pook's Hill. Before he had switched off the engine, the front door opened and Germaine appeared. Heavens, she exclaimed. You're back early. Have you changed your mind again?
Yep, Winnie said. I decided to come back home after all.
She smiled. I'm glad, she told him. I couldn't make out why you were so keen to go back to Hartford so soon after you got out. You come on in, darling, and Myrtle and I will take care of you. Gracious, there's blood on your cheek. Did you hurt yourself? Her voice was warm and loving and made my hair rise slightly. If he tried any monkey business with her, I'd rip his throat out. I growled. Oh, good, she laughed. You got Ponto. Did he have a nice honeymoon, poor darling? Is Dalrymple satisfied? Would you like to put in for one of the pups? I growled again. She laughed. Oh, Winnie, he looks so shattered. What did happen to your head, darling? He grinned.
We almost had an accident. I was headed towards the parkway when a car backed out. We bumped into an apple tree. No harm done, but I was knocked out for a few minutes, and I guess it must have shaken me up.
She lifted her face to his and kissed him until I could feel thick, hot rage mount inside my throat and force itself out in a deep, rumbling growl. Look, she said, he's jealous. Poor Ponto. And she kneeled beside me, put her arm around my neck, and pressed my head affectionately. There, she said briskly, you're a good dog. You're my Ponto, and I'll take care of you. Tompkins glowered at me and her.
Stop driveling over that damn dog, he said, and come on into the house.
Germaine gave me a farewell pat on the head. He's such a good dog, she announced. And now that he's been properly married, he'll settle down, I hope. I've been quite worried over the way he's been acting. But it's all right now, Ponto, isn't it? Was your girlfriend nice, old boy? Huh? Are you happy? I tried to explain things, but all that came to my lips was a series of whines and growls.
Come along, Jimmy, Tompkins insisted. I'm cold. Damn it all, I've had a shock and all you can think of doing is to slobber over a dog? Let him have a run.
So she got off her knees and followed him obediently into the house. I sat for a moment pondering my predicament. This was fate. 3 seconds would have made all the difference, but here I was, a dog. Conditions were reversed, and I might as well be philosophical about it. Winnie never dreamed that conditions were not as they had been before the 2nd of April, just as though Frank Jacklin had never existed. The chances were that he would continue to believe that it was all a dream, a hallucination. As for the FBI and von Bieberstein, putting things first, that was no longer any of my business. Dogs were not expected to develop patriotism. That luxury was reserved for human beings. All I could do now was to wait my chance. Perhaps the time would come when I could repossess Winnie Tompkins' body. Then, by George, I would not waste 1 minute, but would have him chloroformed at once. In the meantime, my cue was to be a good dog. There was a shrill whistle from the house.
Ponto,
Winnie's voice called.
Come here, Ponto. That's a good dog. Come on, Ponto. That's a good dog. I ran, wagging my tail, to the open door, and on all fours entered the house I had left only 2 hours before as its proud master. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of The Rat Race by J. Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I was lying down in the kitchen near the stove on an old rug which Mary Myrtle had spread for me. She was really a nice girl. My educated nose informed me that she was kind, young, and affectionate. When she entered the room, I used to rear up and place my forepaws on her shoulders and lick her ears. She liked me. She used to put her arms around my neck and press against me, and give me a smack on the back and a, "Go on with you. Can't you see I'm busy?" I was lying by the stove when Winnie Tompkins entered the kitchen. Mary Myrtle was bending over the stove, fussing with a saucepan of vegetables. I was quietly sniffing with interest the combination of cooking smells and the scents from the warm spring afternoon. Winnie strolled across the kitchen, took his thumb and forefinger, and gave her a hard pinch on her buttock. "Oh, God!" she shrieked, and turned to confront him. "Oh, you," she observed. "I thought you'd got over all that." He whistled between his teeth, put one tweed-clad arm around her shoulders, and pressed her to him. "Go on," she said in a half-whisper. "I'll call Mrs. Tompkins." Still whistling, with his free hand he tilted her chin up to his face, stooped over and kissed her. I could see her hands flutter and press against his chest for a moment, then relax, then clutch him fiercely as her lips thrust against his mouth. I rose and growled. "Hello," he exclaimed. "Why, if it isn't Ponto. You jealous again, old boy? We can't have a moralist around here, can we, Myrtle?" He turned and kissed her again. I stalked over and stood, rumbling a bit beside her, ready to attack if he carried his dalliance beyond decorum. "Let me go, sir," Myrtle begged in a hoarse whisper. "Tonight?" he asked, holding her close. "Yes," she sighed. "I'll come down, sir, tonight, when the dishes are done and the house asleep." He snapped his fingers at me with an air of assured authority. "Come on, Ponto," he commanded. I followed him with murder in my heart. My toenails clicking on the parquet floor, my tail wagging with slow servility. He led the way upstairs to my wife's bedroom. He tapped on the door. "Come in," Germaine called. "And here's Ponto." I padded across the room to the chaise lounge and lay down beside her. I gave her silk-clad leg a poke with my nose. She smelled lovely. "Thank you, Ponto," she said courteously. I rested my head on my paws and looked at Winnie. He absent-mindedly pulled a cigar out of his pocket, bit off the tip and lighted it, after spitting the shreds of tobacco in the general direction of the fireplace. I could feel Germaine go tense. "I am so glad you decided not to go to Hartford after all," she remarked quietly. "It's much nicer for you here. Myrtle and I can take care of you and see that you have a good rest. Poor darling, you must need one." Winnie blew a heavy puff of smoke toward her bed canopy. I could tell by the way he answered her that he was feeling his way. "Yeah," he agreed. "I might as well get a sample of this far-famed suburban home life you read about." She jumped up and put her arms around his neck. "It's not so bad, is it, Winnie?" she asked gently. "You know, I suppose it's silly to tell such things, but last night I dreamed you were going to have a baby." "Good Lord, Jimmy," he drawled. "I hope not. You know as well as I do that we aren't the kind of people who have kids. If you think there's any danger of it, there's a doctor I know in New York who'll put a good stop to it." Germaine's hand fluttered helplessly at her breast, and her face went white and peaked. A sharp whiff of the acrid sense of human anger and fear came from her body. I rose and eyed Winnie steadily. I was careful not to growl. "Why, I thought," she began, "the other night, I mean, it was all so... What's the matter? What has changed?" He gave a sort of neighing laugh. "Oh, nuts, Jimmy, we aren't the type. Say it's spring, or what have you.
Just for that, are you going to go through hell just to have a little animal that will go, I, at you?
Germaine stood up. Yes, she said, I am. If that's the way these things happen, that's what I want. If it doesn't happen, I never want to see you again as long as I live. But if it does, it will be my business, not yours. I want this baby. You loved me the other night. You needed me. We needed each other. I can't throw that away like a dead cigar butt. He thrust his cigar into the corner of his mouth, a la Churchill.
So that's the way it is it?
He demanded.
Okay, but how am I expected to know that it wasn't Jerry Rutherford?
Oh, Germaine looked at him in utter white-lipped silence. You know that can't be true. After a minute, she spoke to him quite gently. Winnie, she told him, you know, I think you really ought to go to the sanctuary as you planned. You do need a rest, dear, and it would be better if you took it there, where they have trained attendants and good doctors. I'll be waiting here till you come back. Do go, darling. It will do you a world of good. Everything will work out for us all right now.
So, you want to railroad me to an asylum, huh? He snarled. Well, nuts to that. As far as I'm concerned, we're back on the old basis. You go your way, and I go mine. And no brats, mind you, or I'll call the whole thing off. Is that clear?
Yes, Winnie, Germaine replied in a small, frightened voice. You make yourself perfectly clear.
Okay, he told her. Come on, Ponto. He had the nerve to snap his fingers at me. Not even when I had him in the Packard headed for White Plains and chloroform had he stood nearer death.
But Germaine's hand, cold and little, rested briefly on my ears, and I mastered my rage. I followed him into his bedroom, and he slammed the door behind me.
See here, you black son of a bitch, he truthfully addressed me. You seem to have made one hell of a mess of my affairs. Oh, I don't suppose you can understand me now that you're a dog again, but just the same, for 2 cents I'd send you to the boneyard. I've still to find out how much hell you've been raising with my business, but damn it all, couldn't you tell that it didn't suit my plans to be clubby with Jimmy?
I padded loyally across the bedroom and laid my head on his lap. He milked my ears automatically, and I rejoiced, because the more he thought of me as Ponto, the less likely he was to discover my human personality. I had not yet decided when to kill him.
Yes, damn it, Hound, Winnie continued. This is one thing the experts will never know about. It's out of this world. 3 weeks as an involuntary Great Dane, ending up in a shotgun marriage with a big brindle bitch named Bugle Bell III. If you want to know my idea of shooting ducks in a rain barrel, that is it. No privacy at all, just an old boy writing things down in the stud book. Jimmy may think I'm mean, but after that experience, who wants offspring? Cannon fodder or kennel fodder? I don't. Neither would you, Ponto, I suppose, he added. That legally speaking, you are the putative father, not me. Gosh, what an experience.
He reached over to the night table and pulled the brandy bottle out from the little cupboard, which was neatly filled out with glasses, bottle openers, a siphon, and a decanter. He glared accusingly at the bottle.
Damn you, he exclaimed. It's almost gone. My best brandy. Whoever told you could touch my liquor? Oh well, can't say that I blame you. Here, I'll let you smell the cork.
He held it out at me, and I sniffed it dutifully. I jumped back, sneezing.
Not so keen about it, huh? He demanded gruffly. Well, just to even up the score, I'll make you drink some.
He grabbed my lower jaw with his free hand and forced my tender lips against my sharp teeth until I opened my mouth. Then he poured some of it down my throat. I choked, but got it down.
Atta dog, he praised me. Now you just stick around and you'll see some fun.
He went out and closed the door, leaving me alone in the darkened room. An hour or so later, the door reopened, and Winnie swaggered in. He looked slightly more bloated than before, and his eyes were glazed with liquor. He tossed off his clothes, went into the bathroom and took a hot shower. Then he lighted a cigar and lay on his bed in his dressing gown, waiting. After a while, there was a quiet step in the hall and the click of the door handle. It was Mary Myrtle. She was wearing a red flannel dressing gown, and her hair was done up in a pigtail. She closed the door behind her and cast an anxious glance over her shoulder in the direction of the hall. Tompkins guffawed.
Ha ha ha! Who, Jimmy? He demanded. Not her. She knows better than to interfere.
Myrtle cast strange little embarrassed glances to right and left, and I noted that her hands were trembling as they fumbled at the buttons of her dressing gown. I strolled across to her and sniffed the sharp perfume of desire on her limbs. She gave a little squeak. "Oh, Ponto, you gave me such a start." She turned to Winnie. "Take him away," she said. "It doesn't seem decent with him watching." He gave a loose-lipped smile and rolled off the bed.
"Ponto," he ordered, "you're de trop. Get the hell out of here."
He opened the door to the hall and I slunk out into the darkness of the landing. My toes clicked their way across to the door of my wife's bedroom. I lay down on guard, my ear cocked to catch the desperate, stifled sobs of the woman inside. It was then that I decided that Tompkins must die. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. My opportunity to settle the account did not present itself for more than 24 hours. Early the following morning, Myrtle was kicked out and crept upstairs. Winnie slammed the door and snored like a hog until 10 o'clock, at which time he stamped downstairs and roared for breakfast. After he had eaten, he went to his room again, shutting me outside, and dressed himself carefully in the manly tweeds he had been wearing on that first day in the Pond Club. He drove to the station, I assumed, leaving me behind at Pook's Hill with 2 unhappy women. He did not return that evening at all, and it wasn't until late the following morning, that would be Saturday, I figured, although I was already losing my human preoccupation with time, that I recognized the crunch of the Packard's tires on the gravel drive. I was standing just inside the door as I heard his key fumbling in the lock. It was Winnie, and he was drunk.
"Oh, hello, Ponto," he remarked thickly. "So, you're on the welcoming committee. Come on up with me, boy, and hear the dirt."
I followed his uncertain steps upstairs and into the bedroom. It would not be long now.
"Ponto," he announced. "Good old Ponto. Ponto, I'm going to tell you a great secret. You won't tell anybody about it, will ya? You can't."
I lay on the rug and panted at him.
"Yes, Ponto, if you're going to play ball with me, you gotta be one tough dog. Took a run into New York today, and is that one madhouse. Saw Virginia. You know, redhead. She knows her stuff. Had me right back on my 5-yard line before I rallied and scored that touchdown. It was terrific. Called my office. We're rich, boy. Rich as hell. This a tough game, dog. That Briggs gal says the FBI's still worrying about me. Is that a laugh? Hey, Ponto, is that a laugh? She says they want to know, do I remember the week before Easter? Hell, could I forget it? Maybe it's lucky for me I drew that blank. Might have had a tough job ducking the G-men. Ah, they're nuts. I agree, Ponto. I must respectfully agree with you. Did you hear me contradict anybody? It's a lead pipe cinch fooling those babies. Where was I the week before Easter? And sure, I was tucked away in a Catholic retreat at the Seminary of the Sacred Heart doing the Stations of the Cross in St. Michael's Church. Great institution, the Stations of the Cross. Wonderful institution. You can meet anyone and no questions asked. I gave the instructions that sent the Alaska to the bottom of the North Pacific and slipped the black spot to that sap Jacqueline between the scourging and the crown of thorns. Lucky thing I knew all about him. Helped. It was easy, Ponto. Easy. Who's to question a man doing Stations of the Cross if somebody else does them at the same time? He paused and poured a brandy. That redhead's a wonder, Ponto, he told me. She deals 'em straight and plays 'em close to her chest. For 3 weeks she followed my lead without a peep. I was out like a light. Can't remember a thing, but she never let on. I always said the way to act innocent was to be innocent. Not that she knows what it is all about. She thinks I'm playing the black market. She's a racketeer at heart. She is, that tramp. That North Pacific job was no cinch, Ponto. All I had to do was to kidnap that guy Chalmers and substitute a ringer. Old Chalmers? We dropped him in the high Rockies on the flight to Seattle. The Navy was a bunch of saps letting my men take that plane. Sure, we dropped the Navy boys too, along with Chalmers. I sat, ears pricked up, watching him. I could see the throb of the artery in his throat that marked the place for my teeth to meet. Virginia told me the G-men are looking for Von Bieberstein, Tompkins said. Hell, Ponto, even she doesn't know what happened back in 35. Sure, I was broke. Sure, 50,000 would bail me out. Sure, Hitler put up the 50,000. He saved my hide. I made a killing all right. So, I'm Von Bieberstein. So what, Ponto? So what? Want to make anything of it? Sure, I lived up to my end of the bargain. Roosevelt had ruined me. What did I owe Roosevelt? Sure, I took the job. And it was that. A laugh. And was that a laugh? The FBI chasing all over the place for Kurt Von Bieberstein. And all the time, it's little old Winnie Tompkins, Harvard 1920, and good old 1000% American stock. The poor boobs think they've licked Hitler, Ponto, but he's really licked them. You wait and see. I'll still be Gauleiter of Westchester County, so help me.
The moment had come. He was lolling back on his bed, his arms behind his head, his neck exposed. I gathered my muscles and leaped for his throat. End of chapter 35. Recording by Nick Bulka. End of The Rat Race by Jay Franklin.